Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight, we journey into the misunderstood world of Native American hygiene, where smoke, water, and herb-scented rituals create a reality far cleaner than colonial noses cared to admit. In the stillness of twilight, let's peel back layers of myth like birch bark on a spring morning. You may think early America was all mud-caked feet and pungent pelts, but brace yourself. Many native communities were scrubbing, steaming, and scenting their bodies long before European ships kissed the coastline. Of course, they probably won't survive this perception shift. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're tuning in from somewhere far off, post your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing how this sleepy tribe of ours spans the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It starts with dirt. Or more precisely, with the assumption that dirt equals dirty. European colonists arriving in the so-called New World looked at the earth-covered feet and animal hide garments of native peoples and drew a snap judgment. These folks must be filthy. Never mind that the same Europeans had just stepped off ships reeking of mouldy bread and chamber pots dumped below deck. Never mind that many of them still considered bathing a suspiciously indulgent act that risked one's health by opening up the skin's pores to evil miasmas. But perception, as ever, clung tighter than the truth. To the colonists, cleanliness meant smelling like lavender water and talcum powder, if you were rich, or at the very least wearing layers of wool to trap your body odour politely. But for many native tribes, cleanliness was tied to connection, to the land, the spirits, the cycles of the body and the seasons. Dirt wasn't something to be scrubbed off in shame. It was the substance of life itself, walked upon with reverence. And yet, being of the earth didn't mean letting filth pile up unchecked. In reality, what those European observers mistook for unwashed bodies was often a lifestyle of practical and cultural hygiene. It wasn't so much that the natives didn't clean themselves, it's that they cleaned differently. More sensibly, one might argue. In many regions, daily bathing was standard. Streams, lakes and rivers were abundant, and you'd find entire communities rinsing off at dawn, the chill of the water considered invigorating rather than inconvenient. Cold water dips were often taken regardless of season. Ice flows didn't deter the truly devoted. Men might dunk their heads before a hunt. Women would cleanse before preparing food. Children, of course, would splash about regardless of ceremonial intent, because some things never change. What also escapes early accounts is the social aspect of hygiene. Among the Anishinaabe, for example, bathing and steam-based purification were communal acts, often tied to storytelling and ceremony. It wasn't just go wash behind your ears, it was let's cleanse the body and spirit together. Meanwhile, European settlers, especially those fresh off a 6-week Atlantic crossing, had often not bathed in a month, nor changed their linen shirts in just as long, and it showed. Oh, it showed. There's even an awkward moment in some colonial diaries where native hosts insist their foreign guests bathe before entering certain sacred spaces or joining ceremonial meals. Imagine being the stinky kid at the sleepover and not even knowing it. The confusion went both ways, but back to those initial impressions. Picture a Lenape man crouched by a stream in the early morning mist, dipping a deerskin cloth in water, scrubbing his limbs methodically, humming a tune under his breath. Or a woman of the Muskogee Creek tribe braiding her damp, perfumed hair with crushed herbs after a river soak. These were common sights, not exceptions. Even without modern soap, native peoples had an impressive arsenal of cleansing tools. Yucca root, mashed into a frothy pulp, acted as a natural shampoo and soap in the southwest. In the northeast, sweetgrass and cedar served both aromatic and antimicrobial roles. Washing didn't require a pharmacy, it required plants, patience, and a culture that valued the practice. Yet the colonists kept describing them as dirty. Why? Some scholars suggest it came down to cultural blindness. If you don't recognise the method, you assume it doesn't exist. Others argue that such accusations served a political purpose. Portraying native tribes as uncivilized helped justify land theft and religious conversion. After all, who would question the ethics of conquering filthy savages? It's a dark rationale that repeats in history like an off-key song. Still, irony seeps through the records. Missionaries sometimes noted, begrudgingly, that native converts who took to Christianity also seemed to become, well, less tidy. One Jesuit noted how a group of Mohawk women who once bathed daily began avoiding the stream altogether after learning from the French that modesty meant covering their bodies, even from themselves. A cultural clash wrapped up in layers of wool and miscommunication. But while dirt can be spiritual and water cleansing, some of the shocking truths about native hygiene come from what they didn't need: artificial perfume, wigs powdered white, corsets steeped in sweat. The more you compare, the clearer it becomes. Many indigenous groups were not just clean, they were meticulous. And lest you think this was a mere product of warm climates, think again. Tribes in the Arctic Circle use snow like a modern-day bidet, scrubbing their skin red with packed ice after hunting trips. They'd warm up in sweat lodges, wooden structures filled with hot stones and steam, then leap into a frozen lake to rinse. Who needs a hot tub when you've got geothermal resolve? There are accounts, too, of coastal tribes using saltwater rinses to cleanse wounds and soothe skin. In modern terms, that's saline therapy. They were ahead of the spa curve by a few centuries. And no, they weren't rubbing themselves raw with sand. They used soft fibres, fur scrapers, even charcoal paste to exfoliate. Some tribes mixed crushed seashells into salves for a gritty polish. Others applied mud not to remove grime, but to protect their skin from sun and insects. Think less dirty face and more ancient SPF. It's worth mentioning that different tribes had different approaches. The Pueblo peoples had architectural hygiene, sweeping, dusting, daily floor maintenance. The Ojibwe used individualized washing bundles, little kits of herbs, cloths and combs for personal use. Meanwhile, the Haudenosaunee believed that a person's spiritual health was visible in their appearance. If someone looked unkempt, it wasn't a cosmetic problem, it was a sign their soul needed tending. So the next time you imagine pre-colonial America as a patchwork of odour and grime, maybe picture instead the smell of crushed mint, river mist on bare shoulders, and the rhythmic scrape of a bone comb through long dark hair. Imagine clothes being scrubbed on smooth stones, smoke wafting from fragrant fires, a boy laughing as he plunges into icy water beside his grandfather, and while we're imagining, picture a tired European settler peeking through the brush, sniffing suspiciously and assuming the worst. Meanwhile, he hasn't changed his socks in 6 weeks and thinks tooth powder is a luxury for kings. But more on that bit of oral hygiene irony later. Historians still argue whether early colonists truly misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented native hygiene. Either way, what's clear is this: dirt doesn't always mean dirty, and in many ways, native communities kept themselves and their environments far cleaner than the cities and ships from which their critics came. So rest easy tonight knowing this: the truth, once scrubbed clean of bias, always shines a little brighter. He squats at the river's edge before the sun has fully risen, steam curling from his shoulders as he pours another handful of cold water over his neck. The morning fog hugs the banks like a soft animal. Behind him, others begin to stir, some approach with quiet steps, others with laughter bubbling up like spring water. This is not just routine, this is ritual. For many native tribes across North America, bathing wasn't an afterthought. It was the day's first act of harmony. Among the Cherokee, the practice of going to water was deeply ingrained, a cultural cleansing both physical and spiritual. Each morning people walked to the nearest stream or river, immersed themselves completely, 7 times to be exact, and offered a prayer with the final plunge. The water might be icy, even in early spring, but it didn't matter. Cleanliness wasn't seasonal, it was sacred. Of course, the idea of bathing daily, let alone communally, struck many European settlers as bizarre, even dangerous. Cold water was thought to invite illness, especially in the absence of woolen undergarments or thick oils to protect the humours. Where the colonists feared the chill, native peoples embraced it. They saw it as invigorating, grounding and essential to one's place in the natural world. Across the plains, in the hot sweep of Lakota territory, people bathed using not just rivers, but also steam. The inipi, or sweat lodge, was more than a place to get clean. It was a sacred structure of renewal. Stones were heated in roaring fires outside and carried in, placed into a central pit. Water was poured onto them, producing waves of steam that wrapped around the bathers like warm smoke. Inside the lodge, prayers rose with the vapour. It was dark, humid, and filled with the scent of cedar or sage. One emerged from a sweat lodge not just cleansed, but reborn. Similar sweat traditions appeared across the continent. The Navajo had their own type of steam structure, the Ojibwe too. Even in frigid climates like the subarctic, some tribes created makeshift saunas using hot stones and animal hides. Hygiene wasn't about luxury, it was resilience, wrapped in ceremony. Some tribes built more permanent bathing spots. Along the rivers of California, Maidu women carved smooth hollows in stone to create natural bathtubs. These were filled with heated water using hot stones, early jacuzzis, if you will. Not far off, in the Pacific Northwest, the Chinook and neighbouring peoples used communal bathhouses constructed near riverbanks. While settlers soaked in wooden barrels, often just once per month, native communities were rinsing daily, sometimes twice, scrubbing themselves with bunches of reeds or animal tail brushes. And what about soap? You might be surprised. While the settlers brought harsh lye-based soap, often reserved for laundry, many tribes used saponin-rich plants to make foamy, skin-friendly cleansers. The yucca plant, prized in the southwest, was ground into a paste and whipped into a frothy lather. In the southeast, the Cherokee used buckeye nuts or soap root. These natural soaps not only cleaned the skin but left it lightly perfumed. Think earthy citrus, not fake lilac. Even more impressive were the hair washing techniques. Far from greasy braids or untamed tangles, many native people washed their hair frequently, conditioning it with oils made from bear fat or pressed nuts. In the northeast, red cedar oil was a favourite. It smelled divine and worked wonders on thick hair. After washing, they combed their hair meticulously with bone or wooden combs, often etched with designs or family symbols. And hair mattered. Among the Haudenosaunee, cutting your hair was a sign of mourning. Keeping it clean and cared for was a sign of pride. Men often braided it before battle or hunting. Women adorned theirs with beads, feathers, or strips of dyed cloth. Clean hair wasn't vanity, it was identity. There are even stories of entire families brushing each other's hair by firelight in the evenings, passing down songs and legends as they worked out the tangles. A scalp massage and a bedtime story, all in one. Sweat played its own role too. Unlike modern views that link sweat with odour, native people recognised its value. Sweat purified. Sweat meant the body was working, shedding toxins. In many sweat lodge traditions, you were expected to stay inside until the heat forced sweat from every pore. Then, and only then, could you step out into the cool air, wash in a nearby stream, and feel the day begin anew. Interestingly, body odour wasn't the nuisance it later became in Western societies. In fact, many tribes had their own natural deodorants. Crushed mint leaves, powdered bark, clay mixed with lavender. These weren't just sweet-smelling luxuries. They were tools for health, masking body scent while nourishing the skin. Among the Hopi, a mixture of juniper ash and water was rubbed under the arms. The Navajo sometimes used pounded pinon needles. And no, bear fat didn't make you smell like a walking meatball. When combined with herbs, it became a smooth, scented balm. The Inuit, despite their harsh climate, found ways to clean too. With water scarce and freezing, they used snow scrubs, animal fat and smoke to keep their skin supple and bacteria-free. When hunters returned, they often underwent a full rub-down using warm stones and seal oil. This removed grime, softened skin, and crucially prevented frostbite. It wasn't a spa, it was survival. Historians still debate how much time was spent on hygiene versus how much was ceremonial, but evidence points to a constant overlap. Washing was rarely just washing. It prepared the body for marriage, birth, death, harvest, war, and healing. A woman might bathe before weaving her child's cradleboard. A man might enter the river before felling a tree. Water marked transitions. It wasn't just a resource, it was a boundary between moments. And sometimes those boundaries were enforced with surprising strictness. Among the Zuni, it was considered deeply disrespectful to skip a cleansing before joining a group ceremony. If you hadn't bathed, you weren't just unclean, you were out of sync with the universe. People weren't shamed for smelling bad, they were gently nudged to realign themselves. A forgotten plunge in the river wasn't personal laziness, it was spiritual neglect. Contrast that again with the early European settlers. In 17th century London, people routinely tossed buckets of waste from upper windows into the streets. In Boston, chamber pots were rarely emptied, and outhouses often overflowed. Showers, unheard of. Baths, maybe monthly, and only if you were lucky. Perfume was sprayed to mask rot, not enhance charm. One French explorer, after weeks among the Wendat, wrote with grudging admiration, "Their bodies are painted and perfumed. They sweat greatly, and yet they smell not." Translation: the Wendat bathed more often than the French nobility. So when Europeans described native people as dirty, what they really meant was not like us. They saw naked bathing as immodest. They mistook ash-rubbed faces for grime. They misread spiritual rituals as primitive superstition. And in doing so, they missed the astonishing sophistication of a hygiene system built around nature, not industry. You'll find journals where missionaries fret about pagan cleanliness, as if soap and sin couldn't coexist. They worried that the young children they sought to convert were more interested in braiding each other's hair than learning catechism. And yes, some were. After all, who wouldn't prefer cedar oil to fire and brimstone sermons? The irony was this. As diseases swept through colonial settlements, typhus, smallpox, dysentery, native communities, despite their own devastating losses, maintained lower infection rates in areas with strong hygiene traditions. Bathe daily, clean your tools, purify before ceremony, wash the newborn before naming. These weren't just customs, they were public health strategies dressed in sacred robes. Of course, no culture is monolithic. Some tribes bathed more than others. Some rituals evolved, especially after contact with Europeans and the traumas of forced relocation. But the core idea remained. Cleanliness was part of the circle. You cleaned not just for yourself, but for your community, your ancestors, and your land. So next time someone cracks a joke about Native Americans and savages, tell them about the man in the river at dawn. Tell them about the cedar-scented hair, the hot stones glowing in sweat lodges, the babies soothed with mint water. Tell them about a civilization where hygiene wasn't sold in bottles. It was sung into the day. And yes, maybe, just maybe, that settler who complained about the savage stench was actually the one in desperate need of a bath. As dawn stretches its golden fingers across a dew-drenched prairie, a woman of the Lakota tribe stoops to gather sweetgrass. Her hands move with practiced ease, braiding the fragrant strands into a coil that will later be burned, the smoke wafting through her home and clothing. To her, this isn't perfume, it's purification. Across the continent, in a humid clearing deep in Powhatan territory, a man rubs his arms with a pungent mix of pine needles and bear fat, muttering under his breath about the mosquitoes. These practices may seem worlds apart, but they share one aim: to smell fresh, to be clean, to be well. And now we arrive at perhaps the most eyebrow-raising chapter in this fragrant saga: smell, or rather, the truth behind who really stank. It's the ultimate olfactory showdown: early Native Americans versus European colonists. Spoiler alert, it's not looking good for the powdered wigs. Let's start with what people actually noticed. While colonial accounts often accuse native people of smelling earthy, smoky, or strong, these were rarely framed as body odour complaints in the way we might understand them. Strong didn't necessarily mean bad. Often, it simply meant different. A person who wore deerskin and cooked over an open fire might carry the scent of smoke and animal oils, not Old Spice. But even among colonists, there were grudging admissions that native people didn't reek of sweat or decay. If anything, many Europeans were shocked at how clean they were. One account from a 17th century French Jesuit missionary describes a Wendat elder whose breath smelled of sweet roots, and whose clothes carried the air of cedar smoke. Another colonist, writing from Virginia, noted with some jealousy that the Powhatan do not suffer from foul humours as we do. It's a polite way of saying, we stink, and they somehow don't. Let's not kid ourselves. Everyone in the pre-antiperspirant era had body odours, but the key difference lies in management. Most Native American communities used plant-based solutions not just to clean, but to scent the body. Deodorizing wasn't about covering up funk with florals, it was about aligning with nature. Crushed herbs like mint, sage and juniper were commonly used under the arms or around the neck. Smouldering bundles of plants, what we'd now call smudging, were waved over the body to ward off illness, cleanse energy, and yes, give a nice smoky aroma that clung gently to the skin. It turns out a little sage and cedar smoke beats 4 weeks of woolen underwear and zero bathing. And what about clothing? Deerskin, elk hide, and woven grasses don't breathe like modern cotton, but they were routinely aired out, smoked, and sometimes washed with herbal teas or river water. Many tribes built drying racks where garments could hang near a smoky fire. not just to dry but to absorb the antiseptic scent of burning bark and sagewood. Meanwhile, over in the colonies the scent landscape was challenging. Most settlers arrived with little more than 1 or 2 changes of linen which were rarely washed. Shirts became stiff with sweat and food drippings. Lice and fleas took up residence not just on scalps but in sleeves and seams. And since daily bathing was often dismissed as dangerous or immoral, a lot of colonists simply didn't bother. Instead, they powdered. Thick clouds of talc and crushed flower petals were puffed into wigs and onto the chest and back. But rather than truly cleansing, these powders absorbed sweat temporarily, and often made things worse by mixing with oil and grime. Imagine spritzing cologne over a week-old gym sock. Elegant? Perhaps not. Some European aristocrats even resorted to glove scenting, wearing gloves steeped in oils of lavender or musk to politely shield their noses from the masses. In urban Europe, it was common to carry perfumed handkerchiefs, pressing them against the face when passing someone particularly pungent. They should have packed extras for the voyage. So how did native people perceive the scent of their new neighbours? Records are sparse, but we get a few hints. In certain oral histories from the Pueblo people, there are humorous mentions of settlers smelling like spoiled cornmeal. Among the Ojibwe, early contact stories speak of surprise at the metallic and bitter odour carried by the French. Even the scent of leather, a staple in native dress, was tanned using local, often plant-based methods, which lacked the sour edge of chemical European processes. What's more, the native diet may have played a quiet role in the cleanliness of body odour. High in vegetables, lean meats and seasonal fruits, it was free of dairy, refined sugar, and the heavy salted meats that Europeans subsisted on. And while diet doesn't replace deodorant, it certainly helps in the long-term olfactory game. Still, historians argue over whether the native hygiene advantage was universal or just regional. Tribes living near abundant fresh water, like the Choctaw living along the Mississippi, had obvious access to daily baths. But in arid regions like parts of the Great Basin, water had to be used sparingly. In those cases, people turned to smoke baths, standing over slow-burning herbs to allow the heat and smoke to kill bacteria and mask scent. Think of it as the original dry shampoo. Another fascinating angle? In many cultures, the ability to mask one's scent was considered a survival skill. Hunters needed to approach game animals unnoticed. Warriors sought to blend into the forest without alerting foes. A human smell, especially one thick with stress and sweat, could spell doom. So learning to cleanse, deodorize, or even just mask one's presence became a matter of life and death. Young boys might be taught to wash with cold water each morning not just for comfort, but for stealth. Girls would be taught which plants softened the skin and which ones dulled body odour. And those herbs weren't just folk remedies. Modern studies show many had antibacterial properties. Even teeth weren't ignored. While we'll dig into tooth care later, it's worth noting here that bad breath was far less common among Indigenous communities, thanks to the use of chewing sticks, mint leaves, and a low-sugar diet. So yes, if 2 people were standing next to each other in a crowded lodge, one a Mohican elder who brushed daily with birch bark, and one a Dutch merchant who hadn't seen a toothbrush since Rotterdam, the nasal verdict likely favoured the elder. But perhaps the most revealing anecdotes come from missionaries who, once assimilated, changed their habits. Some began using local bathing customs. They learned to appreciate herbal rinses, even noting that their health improved. A few wrote back to Europe with suggestions that perhaps they'd been wrong about the filth of the savages. It was a soft retraction, wrapped in piety. So how did the myth of dirty Indians persist? Partly it was convenience. It's easier to conquer a people when you convince yourself they are unclean. It's easier to evangelize when you believe you're introducing them to proper habits. And it's easier to erase cultural wisdom when you label it superstition. Yet even centuries later, these practices whisper through time. Sweetgrass still burns in many native homes, not as air freshener, but as a prayer. Sweat lodges still steam on reservations and rural lands, drawing heat from stones that remember older stories. And plant-based deodorants? You can find them on the shelves of Whole Foods, now priced at $19.99 and stamped with faux tribal motifs. What was once dismissed as primitive has become trendy. Clay masks, smoke therapy, herbal shampoos, cold plunges. They've all cycled back into the mainstream, stripped of context, but still echoing ancestral wisdom. The same people once mocked for bathing in rivers are now credited with inventing the biohack du jour. So next time you scroll through a skincare reel or hear someone rave about eucalyptus-infused steam, remember the quiet bathers of the past. Remember the smoke-scented garments, the cold water rituals, the herbal balms that soothed both muscle and mood, and remember that when it came to staying fresh in a world without plumbing or perfume counters, the original inhabitants of this land weren't just surviving. They were, quite literally, thriving, and smelling pretty darn good while doing it. The comb glides through the thick, dark strands like a canoe over a glassy lake. Each stroke is deliberate, reverent. A mother hums softly as she braids her daughter's hair, fingers weaving tradition into every plait. Across the fire, a young man ties a strip of otter fur around his own freshly oiled ponytail, the scent of pine and cedar wafting through the early morning air. Hair, in many Native American cultures, was not just a feature, it was a language, a shield, a statement. And taking care of it? That was daily business. Let's talk scalp care, 1600s edition. Long before salon shampoos and conditioning masks, Native Americans across the continent were crafting their own routines using plants, oils, and a knowledge of hair so advanced it would leave modern influencers fumbling for content. And unlike the stiff, powdered wigs of colonial fashion, Indigenous hair was real, often waist-length, and impeccably maintained. Among the tribes of the Great Plains like the Lakota and Cheyenne, men took great pride in long flowing hair. It was often seen as a sign of spiritual strength and personal power. It was washed regularly with natural cleansers. Yucca root was a favourite, and conditioned with animal fats mixed with herbs. Bear grease was common, yes, but it wasn't slathered on like lard. It was carefully melted, infused with sweet-smelling plants, and then applied lightly for shine and strength. The result? Hair that gleamed in the sunlight, resisted breakage, and smelled of forest trails rather than barnyards. And it wasn't just the men. Women from the Iroquois Confederacy were known to spend significant time on hair care. They detangled meticulously using combs carved from bone, antler, or smoothed wood. These combs weren't just tools, they were art, often engraved with tribal symbols or passed down through generations. Some were wide-toothed for detangling, others fine for smoothing or nitpicking, and they worked. Archaeological digs have uncovered combs in pristine condition, testifying to their value and frequent use. There's even evidence of homemade hair masks, mixtures of mashed roots, warm water and crushed flower petals applied before rinsing in streams. In the southeast, the Choctaw and Creek peoples used black walnut hulls boiled into a rinse that both darkened the hair and kept the scalp clean. Think of it as a natural dye and wash combo centuries before the rise of boxed colour. And while settlers looked at this glossy, well-kept hair with a mix of awe and suspicion, they clung to their own ideas of civilized grooming. For many colonists, especially in high society, cleanliness stopped at the neck. Wigs were powdered weekly, rarely washed, and natural hair was usually hidden beneath scarves or caps. Head lice? Common. Dandruff? Expected. If you wanted to rid yourself of vermin, you didn't wash. You shaved your head and put on a fresh wig. Native people, meanwhile, had entire systems in place for scalp health. The Navajo used ground juniper ash to exfoliate the scalp. The Hopi mixed cornmeal with water for a gentle scrub. Mint and sage rinses weren't just for freshness. They also kept lice at bay. In fact, many tribes developed combs specifically designed for delousing, with ultrafine teeth and herbal infusions rubbed directly onto the scalp. Historians still argue whether some tribes used heat-styling methods. There are mentions of heated stones wrapped in wet cloths being pressed gently onto braids to help set them in place. Others believe some hair was smoked, gently over coals to infuse scent and smooth texture. Whether true or not, the visual is powerful. Steam curling through long black hair, a woman humming while adjusting her reflection in a pool of still water. Hair care was also deeply tied to life events. Among the Ojibwe, hair was often left loose in times of mourning and tightly braided for celebration. Children's hair was sometimes trimmed during puberty rites. Warriors might add feathers, beads, or small bones into their styles before battle, not as vanity, but as symbols of past victories, spiritual protection, or family heritage. To lose one's hair in battle was considered tragic, not just for its appearance, but for the stories it carried. Some tribes even had dedicated hairdressers. Among the Apache, certain elders were respected for their braiding and oil blending skills. They would prepare warriors before hunts or rituals, their hands working swiftly and silently, applying mixtures that often included sage, rabbit brush, or powdered flowers. This wasn't about beauty. It was preparation for the sacred, and yes, some hair was removed entirely. We'll delve deeper into grooming and shaving in a later section, but it's worth noting that some warriors shaved part of their heads deliberately, not out of neglect, but precision. The Mohawk hairstyle, partially shaved with a central strip of hair left long and upright, was a cultural marker. It had meaning, pride, and aesthetic appeal all rolled into one edgy silhouette. Not to mention, it terrified enemies. Children too were taught early. Girls learned how to oil and braid by helping their mothers. Boys were shown how to keep their hair clean after wrestling in the dirt or splashing through the creek. There are stories of young siblings combing each other's hair beside the fire, laughing between strokes, sometimes braiding grass or animal fur for practice, and if a comb broke, it wasn't thrown out. It was mended, sanded smooth, or remade from a new piece of bone. Tools weren't disposable, they were honoured. The cultural gap between native hair care and colonial practices was so wide it became a symbol in itself. When missionaries attempted to civilise Indigenous children in boarding schools, one of the first acts was to cut their hair. The practice was devastating. It wasn't just a haircut, it was an assault on identity, heritage and personal pride. Imagine being told that the hair you lovingly cared for your entire life, washed in sacred rivers, perfumed with wildflowers, was dirty and needed to be erased. Even today, for many Native Americans, hair is sacred. Ceremonies are still held before cutting, strands are saved and offered to the earth. Braids are worn with purpose and pride, and oils passed down from grandparents still carry the scents of old forests. The connection remains unbroken, even after centuries of attempted erasure. Interestingly, modern science is only now catching up. Recent studies show that certain plant oils used traditionally by native peoples, like jojoba, cedarwood, and bearberry, have antimicrobial, antifungal, and moisturising properties. In other words, they weren't just guessing, they knew exactly what they were doing, and don't let the simplicity fool you. Hair care wasn't always rustic. Beads, shells, feathers, porcupine quills dyed with natural pigments. These were used not just for decoration, but to indicate social standing, achievements, and marital status. Hair could be read like a story. A young woman with shell beads near her temples might be entering womanhood. A man with twin braids wrapped in red cloth could be preparing for war. Even the act of braiding itself carried symbolism. Some tribes taught that the 3 strands of a braid represented mind, body and spirit, interwoven, inseparable. Unbraiding one's hair was a sign of vulnerability, intimacy or sorrow, and that symbolism endured. Today, across powwows and ceremonies, you'll see elders braiding their grandchildren's hair just as their own grandparents once did, the rhythm of their fingers echoing generations. So the next time you slick back your bangs or reach for a hair tie, pause and imagine another morning centuries ago. A woman crouched beside a fire, dipping her comb into an herbal rinse. A boy squinting into the water, smoothing his hair with wet fingers before his first solo hunt. A young girl giggling as her older sister arranges feathers just so, her reflection dancing on the surface of a stream. It wasn't vanity, it was tradition, health, and art all woven into one glorious strand. The boy grins as he chews on a slender twig, its end frayed into soft fibres that brush gently over his teeth. Around him, others do the same, some humming, some focused, all methodical in their motions. They aren't playing, they're cleaning. Long before toothbrushes in plastic wrappers lined drugstore shelves, Native American communities across the continent had already developed intricate, effective methods for oral hygiene. And tonight, we're about to bite into a truth that might make your modern dentist applaud, and your toothpaste blush. To start, let's clear the air. The myth that Indigenous people had rotten teeth, blackened gums, and no concept of oral care is just that, a myth. In fact, many early colonists remarked with surprise and sometimes jealousy at the state of native smiles. Teeth were often straight, white, and strong. Bad breath. Far less common than in the crowded, sugar-loving cities of Europe. Part of this dental success came down to diet. Traditional Native American diets were rich in fibrous vegetables, lean game meat, nuts and whole grains. Corn, beans and squash, the three sisters, formed the foundation of many meals. Fruits were seasonal and consumed in moderation. And here's the clincher: almost no refined sugar. Without the sticky film left behind by candies and sweetened breads, tooth decay was significantly reduced. Compare that to Europe, where sugar had begun its sweet conquest. Imported from the Caribbean, sugar was becoming a symbol of status. The rich gorged on sugar-laden pastries, jams and tea. By the time they were 40, many aristocrats had smiles like a graveyard, crumbling, darkened and plagued with abscesses. Even in the colonies, imported sugar was a prized luxury, consumed whenever possible, and the results showed. But diet alone doesn't clean teeth, which brings us back to that twig. Known today as chewing sticks, these simple tools were early versions of the modern toothbrush. Native Americans used twigs from specific trees, ones chosen for their antibacterial properties and pleasant taste. Birch, willow, sassafras, dogwood, and the ever-popular black walnut were top picks. The ends were chewed until soft and brush-like, then used to scrub teeth and massage gums. Some were dipped in salt or herbal ash to boost their cleansing power. Birch bark especially had a reputation. It was antiseptic, slightly sweet, and easy to whittle into strips. When early French trappers traded with the Algonquin, they noted the locals' habit of biting birch twigs each morning. One explorer even wrote, half-jokingly, that the women's smiles could shame a bishop's chalice. Whether he meant their teeth or their confidence, we'll never know, but it stuck. In the southwest, where wood could be scarce, people got creative. Ground mesquite pods were mixed with clay and rubbed on the teeth with a finger or cloth. In some Pueblo communities, crushed charcoal from specific woods, mild and alkaline, was added to the mix. Charcoal not only cleaned, but polished. That whitening toothpaste on your shelf today. A less elegant descendant of this ancient trick. Among the Iroquois, oral care was part of daily grooming, not a separate chore. Children were taught to chew rinsing herbs like wild mint and yarrow, both to freshen breath and soothe the throat. Adults often ended meals with a few cleansing mouthfuls of water or a chew from a twined stick soaked in cedar oil. It was not uncommon to see bundles of oral care tools hanging from the rafters in longhouses, right alongside hair combs and ceremonial beads. And then there were toothpicks. Yes, actual toothpicks. Long before the cocktail olive. Porcupine quills, smooth sticks, even bird bones were sharpened to gently remove food from between the teeth. But these weren't carelessly jabbed in at random. There was etiquette, even grace. An elder might pick their teeth while telling a story, pausing to emphasize a point with the tip of a quill. It was part hygiene, part performance. The attention to gum health was also noteworthy. Ashes from sage mixed with water and rubbed along the gums served as a kind of floss substitute and mouthwash. Juniper berries chewed raw were thought to strengthen teeth, and certain tribes used powdered oyster shells mixed with water to make a gritty paste. Not unlike modern toothpaste, but entirely natural and surprisingly effective. Historians still debate how widespread these practices were. Some argue that oral hygiene varied by region, with forested tribes having more access to ideal plants. Others believe it was almost universal, passed from mother to child like any other daily skill. What's clear is this. When it came to mouth care, native people weren't improvising. They were refining. European reactions range from admiration to disbelief. In early Boston, where even the wealthiest often ignored their own teeth until they hurt, missionaries were stunned to see the savages scrubbing and rinsing so regularly. Some adopted the habits themselves. Others dismissed them as quaint, irrelevant to the needs of a Christian gentleman. One wonders if that same gentleman later wept quietly into a rag as a barber yanked out another molar by candlelight. Speaking of dental emergencies, even rudimentary surgery existed. In some tribal communities, aching teeth were soothed with poultices made from tobacco leaves, willow bark, or even mashed cactus. The analgesic properties of these plants dulled the pain. In severe cases, teeth were extracted using sharpened tools, often carved from bone or stone. It wasn't pleasant, but it was swift and by most accounts cleaner than many colonial practices. In urban Europe, the standard dental solution was to visit a tooth drawer, often a barber on the side. He would pry out the offending tooth with iron tongs, without anaesthesia of course, and offer you a swig of rum after the fact. Infection was common. Survival? Not guaranteed. One English traveller, upon witnessing a Mohawk elder soothe a toothache with a warm herbal rinse and a bone tool, reportedly asked, "Might I be treated next?" Unfortunately for him, the elder politely declined. And what about dental decoration? It wasn't widespread, but it did exist. In some Mesoamerican cultures, particularly among the Maya, teeth were inlaid with jade or other stones as status symbols. North of the Rio Grande, the practice was rarer but not unheard of. Some plains tribes filed their teeth into sharp points for ceremonial reasons. Others used staining herbs to darken or brighten their enamel. These weren't acts of vanity. They were identity, visual markers of belonging or achievement. But across most of North America, the goal was simple. Keep your teeth, keep them strong, and keep your breath tolerable enough for conversation in a crowded winter lodge. Children were taught these values early. Chewing sticks were cut to size for small hands. Herbal rinses were sweetened with berry juice to make them more palatable. Parents monitored breath as well as behaviour, gently nudging kids toward the rinsing bowl after meals. There's even oral history from the Great Lakes region describing a tooth song, a rhythmic chant used to teach brushing strokes and gum care. Dental hygiene and music class combined. And while we're romanticising a bit here, sure, not every village had perfect molars. Records do indicate that pre-contact native skeletons show relatively low levels of tooth decay compared to those of contemporary Europeans. Modern studies back this up. Archaeological digs from the Midwest to the Southwest reveal ancient remains with strong intact dental arches, minimal cavities, and signs of intentional oral maintenance. No fluoride, no floss, just centuries of plant-based wisdom and cultural practice. So next time you squeeze a minty dollop onto your bristles or swirl a rinse that burns like battery acid, remember this. Long before artificial flavours and ergonomic brush handles, Native Americans were tending to their teeth with twigs, herbs, and a whole lot of know-how. They understood that a healthy mouth meant a healthy body, and they passed that knowledge down with care, song, and more than a little sass. And somewhere, in some ancestral memory, a grandmother still mutters, "You didn't rinse? No berries for you." The hunter crouches low behind a scrub of sagebrush, silent as the desert wind. His skin glistens faintly with a sheen of carefully blended oils, bare fat thickened with crushed mint and rubbed beneath his arms, along his neck and down the small of his back. Not for fashion, not even for comfort, but for necessity. He cannot afford to smell human. The elk grazing at the tree line will bolt at the first whiff of sweat. For many Native American communities, managing body odour wasn't just about hygiene, it was a matter of survival. Let's talk deodorant, not the kind that comes in a stick with branding like Arctic Blast or Fresh Thunder. We're diving into nature's own toolkit. Bare fat, powdered herbs, clay, smoke, ash, and a little ingenuity, wielded not to mask stench from perfume-hungry suitors, but to exist harmoniously with the natural world. Bare fat, for example, gets a bad rap from people who imagine it as some stinky, greasy smear. But rendered properly, slow-melted over a fire until clear and strained through woven cloth, it became a neutral, smooth base for all sorts of medicinal and cosmetic uses. Among the Lakota and other plains tribes, it was the go-to moisturiser, hair conditioner, and, yes, deodorant. Mixed with sage or sweetgrass, it carried a fresh, earthy scent and left the skin soft, not sticky. When rubbed into the armpits or groin, it helped trap scent, kill bacteria, and soothe skin abraded by heat and movement. And it worked. Settlers who described their native neighbours often remarked on their surprising lack of foul odour. One fur trapper noted in his journal that he could sleep in a teepee among 5 men and 2 dogs with more comfort than in a London boarding house. The irony is almost poetic. Deodorizing practices varied widely by tribe and terrain. In the forests of the Pacific Northwest, people often rubbed cedar needles and alderbark into their skin before hunts or ceremonies. The hider and Tlingit used aromatic smoke, standing above a slow-burning bundle of fireweed roots or cedar shavings, letting the scented smoke seep into their pores and clothing. This smoke bath acted as a sanitizer, insect repellent, and fragrance all in one. Think of it as the original dry spray. In arid regions like the Southwest, clay was king. The Hopi and Zuni mixed fine clay powders with crushed herbs like juniper or pinyon and dusted them on the skin, absorbing sweat and neutralizing odour. The resulting effect wasn't just practical, it was cooling. And in the heat of a desert summer, that mattered more than a hint of rose water. Historians still debate whether these methods were deliberate deodorants or just had the side effect of odour reduction. But for many tribes, smell was deeply tied to spirituality. Some believed strong body odour disrupted harmony with the spirit world. Others held that offensive scent could attract malevolent forces, or simply disrespect the animals being hunted. If you smelled like death and sweat, how could the deer trust you? There are also stories, half whispered in oral traditions, of shamans using scent to diagnose illness. They would lean in close, sniffing the breath, armpits, or even the scalp of the afflicted, identifying imbalance not by touch or sight, but by smell. If the scent was sour, bitter, overly musky, they would prescribe not just medicine but cleansing rituals. Smoke, herbs, diet changes, steam baths, the nose knew. Among the Navajo, a blend of yucca root paste and wild herbs could be applied after a sweat bath to keep the skin fresh. Yucca, naturally high in saponins, foamed when mixed with water and had antimicrobial properties. After rinsing in river or steam bath, a light application under the arms kept things pleasant even through long hikes or dances. And yes, dances. Many ceremonies involved movement, stamping, jumping, whirling under the sun or stars, and a gathering of bodies in close quarters. Maintaining a pleasant presence wasn't just polite, it was ceremonial discipline. Among the Creek, young men were taught to smoke their clothes before dances and apply a scented paste made from crushed pine needles and clay to their underarms. That's commitment. Then there were the fragrant accessories. Sachets of aromatic herbs tucked into clothing, braids wrapped in sweetgrass, beaded pouches filled with dried lavender, worn on a necklace or tied to a belt. These weren't decorative flares alone. They served as subtle, natural colognes, mingling with the wearer's own scent and reinforcing identity, region, and personal taste. Women, too, had their own routines. In some Algonquian-speaking communities, postpartum women bathed with warm cedar tea and rubbed their skin with balsam fir resin. The scent lingered sweetly, masking any body odour and promoting healing. Young girls were taught which plants to pick for their cleaning bundles, little wraps of twine holding twigs, herbs and sweet-smelling grasses for use after bathing or before social events. Not all scents were welcome, of course. Skunk cabbage, while occasionally used in salves or medicine, was definitely not something you wanted wafting off your armpits. And garlic mustard, although powerful, was typically reserved for healing, not hygiene. But the experimentation with scent was constant, evolving with the seasons, the available plants, and personal preference. Europeans, by contrast, approached body odour with a sense of, well, panic. Perfumes, floral waters, scented gloves and handkerchiefs. These were attempts to cover, not clean. In 17th century France, it was considered normal for noblemen to change shirts more often than they bathed, trusting their layers to absorb the worst of their funk. And when bathing did happen, it was often more about soaking than scrubbing. Meanwhile, native peoples were out there mixing antiseptic herbs with bear oil, steaming their sweat away in lodges, and cooling their skin with powdered juniper ash. Functional, ecological, and, dare we say it, a little luxurious. Now, were there outliers? Of course. Not every person had daily access to a stream. Not every band followed the same herbal traditions. During times of war, famine or relocation, hygiene rituals could be disrupted. But the intention, the knowledge, and the cultural value placed on scent and cleanliness ran deep. Interestingly, body odour wasn't always a liability. In some tribes, lovers recognised one another by scent. A young man might leave a strip of his shirt with a favoured girl, perfumed with sage and his own sweat, as a courting gesture. Smell became memory, identity, intimacy. In rare cases, even bad smells had a role. Hunters might intentionally rub themselves with strong-smelling plants to confuse animal scents, or hide among certain environments. And in warfare, some warriors believed the scent of blood, smoke, and sweat could intimidate enemies. A scent, after all, can trigger fear as fast as it triggers comfort. Children learned these scent cues young. They were bathed in herbal teas, rubbed with bear oil to keep skin soft in winter, taught to prepare cleaning bundles and recognise which plants kept them fresh on long journeys. Cleanliness wasn't something you did before a dinner party. It was a daily practice, a point of pride, and a gift to those around you. And when colonial boarding schools began their campaign of cultural erasure, these scent traditions were among the first casualties. Students were scrubbed with harsh lye soap, their herbal bundles confiscated, their clothing burned or replaced. Scent became shame. Natural oils were dismissed as dirty, traditional balms labelled heathen concoctions. The loss wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, sensory, ancestral, but the knowledge persisted, passed in whispers, kept in memory. And today, it resurfaces. Smoke ceremonies, sweetgrass braids, oil infusions, all signs that the original deodorants never left. They just went quiet for a while. So the next time you scroll past an ad for a natural deodorant with activated charcoal, smile a little. Because long before marketing teams packaged the idea, Indigenous communities were already living it. Thoughtfully, elegantly, and often a whole lot fresher than their colonial counterparts. Somewhere, a woman finishes tying her sash, sniffs her sleeve to check the sweetgrass scent and nods in approval. She's ready. She smells like herself. And that, more than anything, is the point. He lays the garment flat over a river-smoothed rock, kneels beside it, and begins to scrub. His hands move quickly, efficiently, dipping a clump of moss into the cold water, squeezing it, then pressing it against the hide. A rhythmic slap, scrub, rinse, repeat. Around him, others do the same. Shirts, leggings, moccasins, each item cared for with intention. This isn't just laundry day, this is life maintenance. Because for Native American communities, clothing wasn't only about modesty or warmth, it was about cleanliness, symbolism, and spiritual readiness. And yes, it was washed. Frequently. It's time to unravel the deeply mistaken notion that Native Americans lived in tattered, filthy garments that were never cleaned or changed. Quite the contrary, Indigenous people developed diverse, region-specific methods for cleaning, maintaining, and even deodorizing their clothing. Just like personal hygiene, garment care was integrated into the rhythm of daily life, and it was taken seriously. Let's start with materials. Native clothing was typically made from natural fibres and hides: deerskin, rabbit fur, elk, woven grasses, bark cloth, or later, woven cotton. These materials were breathable, adaptable, and, most importantly, washable. Leather was treated with natural tannins, stretched, and softened with animal brains or fats. Once finished, it was durable yet pliable, and contrary to what you might expect, not prone to foul odour if properly cared for. Deerskin, in particular, was beloved across the eastern woodlands. It was warm in winter, cool in summer, and easy to clean. The process typically involved rinsing the garment in cold, moving water. Streams and rivers were ideal, followed by scrubbing with a soft bundle of moss, reeds, or even coarse hairbrushes. Soap? Plenty of that too. Soap root, yucca, or ash and clay mixtures were applied as gentle cleansing agents. Afterward, the garment was wrung out and hung to dry near a smoky fire, the aroma adding both antibacterial protection and a comforting scent. This fire drying wasn't accidental. Smoke infused the clothing with natural insect repellent properties. Lice and mites didn't stand a chance. The scent also served as a natural deodorizer. Europeans often noticed the smoky smell on native garments and assumed it meant they were dirty, completely missing that smoke was intentional, medicinal, and cleansing. Today, we might call it aromatherapy. Back then, it was practical genius. In colder regions, like those occupied by the Inuit or Cree, cleaning cloth and fur posed more of a challenge. Water froze. Soap became stiff. Yet people adapted. Snow scrubbing was common, literally rubbing garments with packed snow, then beating them gently to knock out debris. The friction helped lift oils and dirt, and the cold helped kill bacteria. Afterward, the clothes were brushed clean with bone or antler tools and hung to dry in the wind or near indoor fires. Among southwestern tribes, cotton was grown and spun into fabric long before European contact. The Hopi and Zuni, for instance, created lightweight garments from homespun cotton that were washed in hot water mixed with desert soap plants. The garments were then pounded gently with wooden paddles to maintain softness and aired in the sun, which, as modern science confirms, also served as a natural disinfectant. Children were taught from a young age how to care for their clothing. Boys learned to rinse their leggings and moccasins after muddy games. Girls learned which plants softened leather and which ones stained. There was even decorative maintenance. Beaded garments were carefully de-threaded before washing, then reapplied. Paints made from mineral pigments were reapplied with patience and precision. Clothing wasn't disposable, it was living. Ceremonial dress received special treatment. A war shirt, for example, often adorned with beads, animal hair or feathers, was never worn casually. When not in use, it was wrapped in clean hides or hung in smokehouses to keep insects away. Before use, it might be aired in cedar smoke or brushed with pine needles. Every piece had a history, and keeping it clean wasn't just aesthetic, it was respectful. And yes, even undergarments were a thing. While modern styles didn't exist, many tribes wore loincloths or wraps beneath outer garments. These were changed often and cleaned with the same diligence as outerwear. Worn-out pieces were recycled as padding or cord, never wasted. Footwear, like moccasins, were scrubbed with small brushes, usually made of stiff grass bundles or softened wood. Mud and debris were rinsed away, and the interior was sometimes dusted with dried mint or ash to neutralise odour. Deer hair padding could be removed and aired separately. Foot care, as we'll explore more deeply in a later section, was directly tied to clothing hygiene. No one wanted trench foot in the middle of a buffalo migration. Interestingly, some clothing was intentionally designed for easy maintenance. Split sleeves, open side seams or removable panels made it easier to wash just a portion of the garment when needed. Travellers and hunters sometimes carried spare cloth wraps or stitched-on patches that could be peeled off, rinsed, and redressed without needing to stop for a full wash. Think of it as modular fashion, with a wilderness twist. Among coastal tribes, saltwater played a role. Seaweed, surprisingly, was sometimes used as a scrubbing aid, and garments rinsed in briny water were thought to retain a longer-lasting freshness. Combined with sun-drying and the constant wind, it created a kind of natural dry-cleaning process. The Chinook and Salish peoples were known to keep their ceremonial garments impeccably bright, despite living in often damp and rugged environments. And what about those infamous beads and fringe? Didn't they make cleaning harder? Yes, and no. While intricate beading could complicate scrubbing, the pieces were often removable or modular. Fringe, meanwhile, served a dual purpose. Not only decorative, it also helped wick moisture and shake off dust or debris as the wearer moved. During travel, it kept legs cool and dry. And during laundry time, it was scrubbed with a fine brush and stiffened back into shape with a bit of oil or grease. Even clothing storage was a hygienic affair. In wigwams, longhouses and lodges, clothing bundles were often stored off the ground, hung from poles or placed on elevated racks. Smoke from central fires would drift upward, infusing the garments with that same antiseptic aroma. Bugs were kept at bay, moisture was reduced, and the clothing stayed fresh longer. Some tribes even stored garments in bark-wrapped bundles layered with dried herbs like sweetgrass or wild mint to enhance scent and preservation. Colonial observers, ever judgmental, often misunderstood these routines. One missionary complained that the Indians spend more time scraping and tending their buckskins than we do combing our wigs, which, when you think about it, says more about the wig than the buckskin. There's even a quirkier side to native fashion hygiene, stain prevention. Many garments were rubbed with a thin layer of ash or clay before being worn for travel or work. This layer acted as a barrier, making it easier to shake off spills, sap or dust. After the day's work, the garment could be patted clean, with less actual washing needed. It's a tactic modern hikers might recognise. Trail pants with stain resistance. Anyone. And let's not overlook fragrance. Clean clothes weren't just about removing dirt, they were about creating harmony. Bundles of crushed flowers or aromatic herbs were sometimes placed inside clothing rolls, much like modern sachets. Garments were aired over lavender, sage or juniper fires. The scent was calming and the symbolism powerful. Stepping into a freshly smoked dress or shirt meant stepping into a mindset, one of presence, pride and preparation. Some modern native artisans continue these traditions today, infusing their handmade garments with ceremonial smoke, stitching herbs into hems or using ancestral cleaning recipes. When you wear a hand-tanned buckskin vest cleaned in river water and smoked with cedar, you're not just wearing clothing, you're wearing a story. So next time someone raises an eyebrow at historical native fashion, point them toward the riverbank, the smokehouse, or the sunlit bluff where clothing flutters like flags of care, cleaned not just with water and plant, but with pride and practice. Because in these communities, being well dressed didn't stop at the cut or colour. It meant being well kept, well scented, and ready for whatever journey lay ahead. The woman adjusts her skirt as she kneels by the riverbank, her fingers deftly undoing the knot of her sash. A few paces away, another woman rinses a cloth in the stream, the sunlight catching the sheen of clean flowing water. They chat softly, unbothered by the open space, sharing laughs while tending to what many modern minds would label private hygiene. Yet here, privacy is not secrecy. It's trust, routine, and unspoken respect. Let's talk about intimate hygiene, the kind that no colonial journal dared to fully describe and that many history books gloss over like it never existed. But it did, thoroughly, thoughtfully, and often with more practicality than the chamber pots and frilled drawers of Europe. For Indigenous people across North America, cleanliness extended well below the waist. While specifics varied by region, climate, and culture, intimate hygiene was approached with the same earthy pragmatism as bathing or garment care. It was just another part of being whole. Start with water, rivers, lakes, streams, even snow. Daily rinsing wasn't limited to arms and legs. Full-body washing included the underarms, groin, and genitals, often using cupped hands or soft cloths woven from plant fibres. These weren't occasional emergency efforts. They were daily or near daily, sometimes more frequent during menstruation, pregnancy, or postpartum recovery. Among the Cherokee, women often used shallow areas of running water for gentle cleansing, particularly during or after menstruation. Cedar or sweet gum leaves were sometimes brewed into light infusions, lukewarm washes poured with care and intention. Among the Cree, snow was used in winter months, packed into soft cloths or applied directly to cleanse the skin, followed by warming with fur or bear grease. Cooling, astringent, surprisingly effective. No plastic bottles, no loofahs, just a sharp awareness of one's body and a landscape that provided everything necessary. And this wasn't gender-specific. Men too cleansed thoroughly. Before hunting, before ceremony, and even before marriage rites, a man was expected to wash every part of his body, his honour, his readiness, measured in cleanliness. Among the Hopi, pre-marriage cleansing involved a full-body smoke bath followed by meticulous washing using yucca suds. It was not about smelling good for a partner. It was about purifying one's energy. Young people were taught from childhood how to maintain intimate hygiene. Girls were shown how to clean themselves with rinsing herbs like mint or yarrow, which offered both antibacterial and soothing effects. Boys learned how to scrub properly in rivers, ensuring no part of the body was left out. This was not awkward. It was practical. It was life. And perhaps what made it all work was the lack of shame. Unlike Victorian Europe, where even the mention of bodily functions sent cheeks aflame, Indigenous cultures approached intimate hygiene with calm acceptance. Bodies were bodies, capable, sacred, and deserving of care. You wouldn't mock someone for rinsing their hands, so why blush over washing anything else? There were even tools, soft wads of moss, pads made from cattail fluff, cloths sewn from softened buckskin or tightly woven bark fibres. These were used like modern washcloths, or even early sanitary napkins, a topic we'll explore more later. When used for daily cleaning, these cloths were rinsed thoroughly in water, wrung dry, and left to sun bleach. Sunlight was a sanitizer, one of nature's finest. Ash, too, played a role. Fine white ash from certain burned plants, like sage or birch, was sometimes mixed with water and rubbed gently on areas prone to moisture or irritation. The ash had both drying and antibacterial qualities. It worked not unlike talcum powder, without the industrial scent or health warnings. In hotter climates, like among the Pima people of Arizona, sand was used in a fascinating way. Clean, fine sand was sometimes warmed in the sun and poured into shallow pits where people sat briefly to allow the natural friction and absorption to refresh their skin. The sand acted as a mild exfoliant and odour absorber and was especially useful for those who couldn't bathe daily due to water scarcity. And let's not forget smoke. Just like it was used for clothing and general deodorizing, smoke was occasionally part of intimate hygiene as well. Sage smudging of the body, including the lower abdomen and thighs, was a common practice before ceremonies. Among some plains tribes, women used low smoke fires to cleanse themselves after childbirth or menstruation, allowing the warmth and aroma to aid recovery and freshen the skin. While modern minds might flinch at the idea of such exposure, these practices were conducted with discretion and respect. Men did not barge in on women's spaces, women did not intrude on men's rituals. Community bathing didn't mean communal nudity unless culturally accepted, and personal care had its own etiquette, silent, efficient, and woven into the fabric of daily life. There was also a seasonal awareness. In summer, rivers and creeks allowed for full immersion. In winter, snow, smoke, and warmed cloths became the method. You didn't just clean when it was convenient. You cleaned because life required it, because you knew the consequences of neglect, irritation, infection, discomfort. And no one wanted that when walking miles through snow or riding a horse across prairie winds. Colonial observers rarely recorded these habits, partly because they didn't understand them, and partly because modesty prevented them from asking. When they did observe, they often interpreted what they saw through a lens of misunderstanding. One Jesuit wrote of a group of women scouring their thighs and arms with a fury unknown to Christian ladies, clearly not recognising the gentle, repetitive ritual of rinsing with ash-infused water. He thought it strange. She thought it standard. And of course, there was a cultural double standard. While European women layered undergarments and prayed their linen chemises would wick away sweat, native women used breathable cloth, occasional inner wrappings of moss or bark fibre, and constant rinsing to stay fresh. One method trapped odour, the other removed it. Among the Inuit, personal care involved rubbing the body with seal oil after cleaning, especially in cold months. The oil created a barrier against windburn and chafing, but it also helped preserve skin health in sensitive areas. Cracking or irritation, a dab of warmed oil and a moment by the fire, hygiene and healing hand in hand. And perhaps most striking was how seamlessly intimate hygiene was tied to dignity. A woman might cleanse before a naming ceremony for her child. A man might prepare for battle with a final rinse in the river, whispering a prayer as he passed his hands through the water. Cleanliness wasn't vanity, it was readiness. The body was the vessel for every task, every ritual, every journey. Even in times of illness or disability, family and clan members assisted one another with care. Elders were bathed gently by younger kin. Cloths were warmed, herbs prepared, water fetched with respect. Nothing about the human body was shameful. Its maintenance was an honour. To care for another's hygiene was to acknowledge their value, their soul. When boarding schools arrived, and with them the European shame culture, these traditions were dismissed and mocked. Natural methods were forbidden, labelled uncivilised. Girls were told not to touch themselves there. Boys were punished for bathing communally or without supervision. Intimate hygiene became a source of fear and embarrassment. What had once been natural became taboo. But many traditions endured, in secret, in whispers, in the quiet passing of plant knowledge from grandmother to granddaughter. Even today, native health clinics sometimes include traditional healers who offer advice on holistic body care, drawing from ancient methods. Modern adaptations are flourishing too. Herbal rinses inspired by yarrow and mint are making their way into Indigenous-owned wellness brands. Sweetgrass-infused salves, cedar oil sprays, birch extract soaps. The old ways returning, respectfully reimagined. So the next time you reach for a wipe or a scented wash and wonder how anyone survived without these luxuries, think of the woman rinsing cloth in the river, the hunter applying ash with a calm, practiced hand, the young girl learning to prepare her first cleansing bundle. They lived close to the land, and the land in turn gave them everything they needed to stay clean, comfortable and proud. Because in the quiet world of daily rituals, some of the most powerful truths are the softest ones, not shouted from rooftops but whispered between branches beside water or passed through steam. The scent of sage floats gently through the narrow lodge, curling in tendrils along the low ceiling. Hot stones, glowing red from the fire, sit nestled in a pit at the centre, radiating heat into the dim, humid air. A bowl of water is lifted. It tips. Steam erupts with a hiss, and within moments, every breath becomes heavy and rich. Around the stones, men sit in silence, sweating, meditating, praying. This isn't just bathing. It's renewal, a ritual, a cleansing not only of skin but of spirit. Throughout Indigenous North America, hygiene was never just physical. It was ceremonial, and no tradition better embodied that connection than the sweat lodge. The sweat lodge, known by many names across cultures, including Inupi among the Lakota, Temazcal among the Nahua of Central America, and other terms across the continent, was both sacred space and spa, prayer chamber and sauna. It was a place to sweat out more than toxins. It was for regrets, fears, illness, and lingering thoughts. It was a cleansing of the body to realign the soul. Constructed from flexible saplings bent into a dome and covered in hides or blankets, the sweat lodge was intentionally small, dark, and enclosed. The size ensured maximum heat retention and symbolized the womb of Mother Earth. Stepping into the lodge was return, a rebirth. Inside, bodies would sweat until drenched. Muscles loosened, skin flushed, pores opened, and as the water hit the stones, prayers whispered into the steam. The ceremony had structure. 4 rounds, 4 directions, 4 pours of water onto the stones. Each round brought more heat, more chanting, more purification. Songs were sung in the tribal tongue. Each breath became thick with cedar, sage, and sweetgrass. Every drop of sweat became a release of illness, of sadness, of disconnection. Before entering, participants fasted or abstained from certain foods. They washed thoroughly. They dressed lightly, perhaps in a simple cloth wrap or nothing at all, depending on the tradition. The lodge was a sacred zone, and entering it unclean, physically or mentally, was not just disrespectful, it was dangerous, spiritually speaking. The heat was intense. In some lodges, temperatures could rival those of a modern Finnish sauna. But it wasn't just about tolerating discomfort. It was about shedding layers of self. The communal nature of the lodge also reinforced bonds. To sit beside your uncle, a neighbouring elder, or a young warrior, all stripped to the basics, sweating and singing together, was to remember your shared humanity. Colonists who witnessed sweat lodge ceremonies reacted with confusion or horror. One Puritan diary called it a devil's oven. Another referred to it as a primitive punishment house. These observers, unfamiliar with the symbolic language of purification, mistook sacred sweat for savagery. But the practice was deeply rooted in spiritual cosmology. Among the Lakota, each stone represented an ancestor, a spirit, a piece of the sacred world. Pouring water over them released their energy. Among the Diné, or Navajo, similar steam structures were used in combination with sand painting ceremonies to realign internal energies. And these weren't exclusive male spaces. While some lodges were gender-specific, many traditions included ceremonies specifically for women, particularly surrounding menstruation, childbirth and motherhood. These versions were gentler, sometimes incorporating soft singing, massage and herbal infusions. The idea was the same, body and spirit in harmony. Herbs played a major role. Sage was the most common, used both as a smudge before entering and as a cleansing agent within the lodge. Cedar was burned for purification. Sweetgrass, with its caramel-like scent braided and dried, was used to invite blessings. Participants often rubbed ash or clay on their skin before entry, helping to draw out impurities. The heat would open pores, the herbs would do their work, and afterward, a cold plunge into a stream completed the cycle. The transition from heat to cold was crucial. Not only did it prevent overheating, but it also sealed the ritual. It was common to emerge from the lodge still steaming and step directly into snow or river water. This was not for thrill-seeking. It was to seal the cleansing, to reawaken the senses. The body had been emptied. Now it was ready to re-enter the world. And yes, it was hygienic. Sweat expelled toxins, heat killed bacteria, steam opened pores, water rinsed away debris. But more than that, these ceremonies address stress, trauma, and mental fog. In a time before antidepressants or me time, the sweat lodge offered a full-body emotional reset. In some regions, lodges were used weekly. In others, they marked seasonal changes, births, or major decisions. A warrior might enter before battle. A grieving mother might enter after a burial. A boy might sweat before his vision quest. These were thresholds, not just rooms. Modern studies have even begun to explore the physiological benefits of traditional sweat lodges, improved circulation, reduced inflammation, and mental clarity among them. But for the people who built them, none of that was new. They knew from experience and story that the human body is not a machine. It's a vessel, and vessels must be cleansed, not just with soap, but with steam, silence, and song. Interestingly, some tribes also use smaller, more personal sweat tents. These single-person huts functioned like mini-lodges used during recovery from illness or emotional trauma. Heated with stones and sealed with hide, they allowed for solo reflection. Think of it as the original one-person spa pod, but with more spiritual purpose. Beyond the sweat lodge, ceremonies involving water and heat abounded. Among the Iroquois, people engaged in steam baths during winter, using heated rocks and enclosed wooden structures. The Choctaw had their own versions of cleansing ceremonies, involving hot baths, herbal rinses and chanting, and these rituals weren't static. As tribes were displaced and relocated, they adapted. In the 1800s, as Western expansion pushed tribes into reservations, sweat lodges became smaller, more hidden. Some were banned entirely by missionary laws. Still, people gathered in secret. They sang softly. They kept the fire burning. Today, many Indigenous communities have revived sweat lodges, reclaiming them not only as spiritual centres, but as cultural anchors. Some lodges welcome non-native guests, under strict respect and guidance, while others remain closed, private, sacred. The rules are simple. Come clean, come humble, come ready to let go. Even outside the lodge, the principles live on, bathing before ceremony, smoking the body with sage, praying while washing. These acts, subtle and constant, remind us that hygiene can be spiritual, that scrubbing away sweat can be a form of surrender, that steam can lift more than grime, it can lift grief. Colonial diaries may never fully capture the peace of lying on cool grass after a sweat, the stars above, your skin tingling, your mind quiet. But those who've sat in that silence know. They know the truth the stones whisper, that real cleanliness begins inside. And perhaps that's the most revolutionary part of Indigenous hygiene, its refusal to separate body from soul. Every wash, every scrub, every drop of sweat had meaning. It wasn't about vanity, it was about vitality. So when someone asks, how did Native Americans stay clean without bathtubs or plumbing? Point to the lodge, the smoke, the cedar, the steam rising into the dawn, and say, they didn't just clean themselves, they purified, they aligned. They remembered who they were, drop by drop, breath by breath, until the body shimmered and the spirit smiled. The boy sits cross-legged by the fire as his grandmother parts his hair with a carved wooden comb. Her hands move with practiced care, weaving through the strands, inspecting, searching. In her lap rests a small bundle of herbs and a narrow tool with finely notched teeth. Part comb, part tradition, part parasite prevention. Tonight is not just about comfort. It's about diligence. It's about keeping the invisible at bay. Let's talk about bugs, specifically head lice, fleas, and other uninvited guests. Because no matter how clean your rivers or sweet your smoke, nature occasionally sends tiny challenges crawling through your hair and across your skin. And while early Europeans often endured such infestations as inevitable, many Native American communities took an entirely different stance: prevention, grooming, and good old-fashioned teamwork. The myth that pre-contact Native Americans tolerated lice or lived with it is laughably uninformed. In reality, lice were treated as serious nuisances and handled with deliberate, often surprisingly advanced hygiene techniques. From custom-made delousing combs to herbal repellents to social nitpicking routines, native people waged a constant, quiet war against parasites, and usually won. Let's begin at the top, literally, with the scalp. In tribes across the plains, woodland and desert, personal grooming was both a necessity and a bonding ritual. Head lice, if left alone, could cause itchiness, infections and irritation. So regular inspection and grooming became standard practice. Grandparents would check children. Friends would check each other. Even warriors, hardened from battle, would pause to sit in a circle and comb through each other's hair, chatting softly while checking for tiny interlopers. This was not monkey behaviour, as some early colonists derisively wrote. It was community hygiene in action. A knit comb, often carved from bone or hardwood, was a prized household item. Its fine teeth could catch and remove lice or eggs. In some communities, the combs were even soaked in infusions of cedar or juniper, which repelled insects and infused the hair with a clean forest scent. Hair washing, as discussed earlier, played a major role in prevention. Herbs like sage, sweetgrass and yarrow were steeped into teas and poured over the scalp. Yucca root, a natural foaming cleanser, was massaged into the scalp weekly, or more often during warmer months. Children were encouraged to wash their hair frequently. especially if they played in communal areas, shared blankets, or travelled. And for stubborn cases, enter the smoke. Smoke cleansing wasn't only spiritual, it had practical applications. Smoke from certain woods, especially juniper and sagebrush, was believed to kill or repel lice. In some traditions, a blanket would be thrown over the head, while the person sat above smouldering herbs, allowing the smoke to permeate the hair and scalp. Think of it as a natural fumigation, and yes, it worked. The heat and compounds in the smoke, when used carefully, helped deter parasites without damaging the skin or hair. There were also powdered deterrents. Finely ground ash, dried herbs, or crushed seeds were sometimes sprinkled into the hair and combed through. Not unlike modern dry shampoo, these mixtures absorbed oil and discouraged infestations. Some included aromatic elements like lavender or cedar bark, adding a pleasant scent along with function. Among the Inuit, lice were less common due to the extreme cold, but when they did appear, they were handled swiftly. Clothing was smoked or frozen, and scalp treatments often included seal oil mixed with herbs. Clothing and bedding were shaken outside in sub-zero temperatures, killing bugs naturally. Ice as insecticide, unbeatable. Let's not forget fleas either. Homes weren't immune to their bitey annoyance, but native families developed clever techniques to prevent infestations. In longhouses and teepees, fresh greenery was often laid under sleeping mats. Cedar boughs, pine needles or sweetgrass layers were replaced frequently, creating a fresh, clean-scented barrier that insects avoided. The oils in these plants acted as natural repellents. In warmer regions, such as among the Choctaw and Creek peoples, homes were often swept daily with bundled herbs that served both as brooms and insect deterrents. Floors weren't just cleaned, they were perfumed, and since most structures had open ventilation and regular smoke from cooking fires, insects had a harder time settling in. Contrast that with colonial cabins, often musty, dark and rarely cleaned, true flea resorts. And what about clothing? Yes, even garments got the anti-bug treatment. As we touched on earlier, clothes were often dried over smoky fires, not just to cure or scent them, but to kill lurking insects. Fleas, lice, mites. None of them like smoke. Regular airing, shaking, brushing with stiff reeds, and infusing fabrics with powdered herbs were all part of routine care. Some families even sewed sachets of dried herbs, like mint or pennyroyal, into hems and seams of clothing. These acted like wearable repellents. Today's essential oil sprays, an echo of that ancient innovation. Interestingly, some tribes recognized certain times of year as bug season and increased their grooming accordingly. In spring and summer, when humidity and warmth made lice more likely, people bathed more often, combed more carefully, and even trimmed hair shorter. Men sometimes shaved parts of their heads, or kept hair oiled with insect-repelling mixtures. Women braided tightly, reducing exposure and making lice easier to spot. And children weren't passive in this hygiene culture. They were taught how to recognize signs of lice, how to sit patiently during combings, and even how to check their siblings. One oral tradition from the Great Lakes region tells of lice check songs sung by sisters as they combed, keeping rhythm with their strokes. It wasn't a shameful process, it was normal, it was care. Compare all this to colonial practices. Head lice ran rampant in Europe. Wigs were full of them. Hats passed from person to person carried entire ecosystems. Since many Europeans rarely washed their hair, lice were a constant companion. Powdering one's wig only covered the problem with perfume and flour. It didn't solve it. Some colonial settlers adopted native delusing habits after seeing their success. One diary from a fur trader mentions his Mohawk guides washing their hair with pungent root water and careful attention, and notes, "Not a single nit did I spy upon them." Meanwhile, his own party scratched endlessly. Historians still argue how widespread parasite issues were in indigenous communities. Skeletal remains rarely reveal such infestations, but artifacts, oral history and first-hand colonial records paint a clear picture. Native people didn't tolerate lice, they treated and prevented them with remarkable success. And beyond the physical act, delousing had social meaning. In many tribes, grooming someone else's hair was an act of intimacy. Lovers might sit and check each other's scalps. Grandparents used the time to pass down stories. Even warriors before battle might allow a close friend to braid their hair and check for pests, removing not just nits, but tension. These quiet moments remind us that hygiene was never just individual. It was communal. It was relational. Clean hair meant a healthy body. A lice-free scalp meant less risk of infection. A delousing circle meant an evening spent together, building connection while dismantling discomfort. In today's world, where lice still sneak into schools and flea collars still jingle on pets, it's tempting to think of these as modern annoyances, but they're ancient visitors, and native people, long before the word pesticide was coined, had already figured out how to keep them away, with smoke, herbs, patience, and a good comb. So next time you run a brush through your hair, or feel that first suspicious itch on your neck, think of the firelight, the circle, the careful hands parting your hair with tenderness and a smile. Clean doesn't always come from a bottle. Sometimes it comes from ritual, rhythm, and a touch of cedar-scented care. The cradleboard sways gently from the lodge rafters, a tiny foot poking from beneath a neatly wrapped blanket. A soft coo escapes the infant's lips as her mother leans over, adjusting the padding and brushing away a speck of dust with the care of someone tending a sacred flame. Cleanliness, even at this earlier stage of life, is second nature. It's not something taught with lectures or scoldings. It's modelled. Passed through generations, lived in rhythm with the seasons and the senses. Caring for children's hygiene in Native American communities wasn't a haphazard affair. Long before modern baby wipes, antibacterial soaps, and lavender-scented lotions took over, Indigenous families had already perfected the art of infant cleanliness using tools gifted by the land: moss, clay, bark, smoke, and time. What might surprise you is not only how effective these methods were, but how thoughtfully they were woven into the daily care, protection, and development of the child. Let's begin with the youngest of all, newborns. Immediately after birth, mothers or midwives cleaned the infant using warm herbal water, typically infused with plants like yarrow, sage, or chamomile. These herbs weren't chosen at random. They soothed the skin, offered mild antiseptic properties, and introduced the baby to the familiar calming sense of their environment. A soft piece of cloth, often deerskin or woven fibre, was dipped and used to gently wipe the baby clean. In colder climates, a heated stone might be used to warm the water bowl, ensuring the baby's first moments were both sanitary and comforting. Cradle boards, iconic and practical, were lined with soft, absorbent materials that served a dual purpose: support and sanitation. Among the Navajo and Apache, dried sphagnum moss was used as an early form of diapering material. Moss is naturally absorbent, antiseptic, and biodegradable. When layered in the cradle board, it could wick away moisture, reduce odour, and prevent rashes. The moss was replaced regularly, sometimes multiple times per day, washed or dried by the fire, then restocked from the wild. Other tribes used variations on the same theme. The Cree add crushed bark or pulverized dry leaves to the moss to increase absorption. Some Pacific Northwest tribes used softened cedar bark as padding, while Plains peoples sometimes relied on finely shredded buffalo fur for colder seasons. Whatever the material, the key was cleanliness and breathability. The result? Babies stayed dry, warm, and remarkably rash-free, and they didn't stay wrapped all day. Regular airing was an essential part of baby hygiene. Infants were often taken from their cradle boards for periods of time during the day, not just for nursing or cuddling, but to stretch, kick, and dry out. This practice helped prevent chafing and allowed caregivers to clean the baby's skin with cloths dipped in warm herbal rinses. Mint, chamomile, or lavender might be used in the summer, cedar, sage, or pine needles in the winter. The smell of a well-cared-for baby was not sour milk or damp cloth. It was forest sweet, earth soft. Interestingly, many tribes practiced early toilet training through observation and intuition. Among the Inuit, mothers carried babies in the hood of their parkas and learned to interpret subtle signals, fidgeting, vocal cues that indicated a need to eliminate. They'd swiftly remove the baby, allow them to relieve themselves on the ground or into prepared materials, then clean and rewrap them. This method, not unlike today's elimination communication practices, meant that by a year or so, many infants were mostly dry. For those moments when waste did soil the cradle board, cleaning was efficient. The moss was discarded or composted. The board itself, often made from smooth wood, was wiped with snow, water, or herbal rinses, then dried near fire and re-smoked. The practice of smoking cradle boards helped deter insects, prevent mould, and imbue them with a pleasant scent. It also subtly taught the child's senses that smoke and cleanliness were linked, an early lesson they'd carry into adulthood. Older children, toddlers and beyond, were taught gradually to care for their own hygiene, but this wasn't done with commands, it was modelled. When a mother bathed in the river, her children watched. When an older sibling washed their face with spring water, the younger one copied. There was no potty training boot camp, it was cultural osmosis. Little ones learned to rinse their hands after meals, to wipe their faces with fresh leaves, to avoid sitting in mud or lingering in damp clothes. Moss, bark or cloth pads were often tucked into belts or sashes as backup during long walks or hunts. A child might learn to change their own padding by 4 or 5, especially if living in nomadic or active communities. Among the Haudenosaunee, it was common for children to participate in grooming circles. Each evening, families gathered by the fire. Hair was brushed, hands were cleaned, fingernails inspected, feet wiped. Any nits found were removed with care. Any dirt behind the ears was addressed with gentle teasing and swift cloth work. It wasn't punishment, it was bonding. Cleanliness was family time. Even oral hygiene started young. Chewing sticks were cut to child size. Flavoured herbs like wintergreen or sweet birch were offered to encourage the habit. There are accounts of toddlers mimicking their parents, gnawing on tiny twigs and pretending to scrub their gums. And because their diets were low in sugar, the results showed. Few cavities, strong enamel, and minimal bad breath. Insects and rashes, common risks in any community, were handled with diligence. Babies' clothing was aired regularly. Bedding was changed and smoked. Any sign of irritation led to a swift application of natural remedies. A smear of bear fat mixed with mint, a dab of clay, a poultice of crushed willow bark. And elders knew how to spot the signs: scratching, fussiness, heat. They didn't reach for creams or syringes. They reached for their bundles, their herbs, their stories. And yes, there were quirky methods too. In the Great Plains, some tribes dusted children with powdered cattail fluff, or crushed shells to absorb moisture in the summer. In desert climates, kids might be given dust baths, rolling in clean dry sand or ash to remove sweat and keep cool. Far from messy, these baths were strategic, antibacterial, and remarkably effective. Among the Coast Salish, children were taught early how to cleanse themselves in tide pools or along the edges of streams, learning which stones made good scrubbing surfaces and which seaweeds soothed the skin. Hygiene doubled as environmental education. By adolescence, hygiene was tied to identity. A young girl preparing for her first moontime was bathed in special herbs, her hair oiled and braided, her face painted with protective clay. A boy stepping into manhood bathed in cold streams before his vision quest, rubbed with charcoal, his body watched over by elders. Cleanliness marked transitions, not just of skin, but of life. Historians still argue whether these traditions were formalised rites or simply built into daily life. The truth is probably both. When a child is born into a culture where washing is sacred, smoke is cleansing, and scent carries memory, hygiene becomes more than a task. It becomes a language. Even today, many native families continue these traditions. Elders pass down recipes for herbal rinses. Parents make sweetgrass bundles for their newborns. Cradleboards are lined with natural, fragrant fibres. In some communities, youth learn the old ways alongside modern ones. Shampoo in one hand, cedar oil in the other. So the next time you see a baby swaddled in blankets, wriggling and cooing, remember the ones who came before, the mothers who lined their babies' cradles with moss, the fathers who carved the first night comb, the children who learned to bathe in sunlight and sage smoke. Their lessons linger in every clean cheek, every brushed braid, every moment a parent bends low to wipe a child's brow with a leaf and a smile. Smoke rises gently from a cooking fire as the scent of pine and roasted meat fills the lodge. Outside, a visitor approaches, and within moments the household stirs into motion. The mat at the doorway is swept. A pot of herbal water is set to boil. A soft cloth is folded neatly beside it. This isn't just preparation for a meal. It's a gesture of hygiene, of welcome, of respect. Because in many Native American communities, to host someone was to clean for them, to cleanse with them, and to make them feel not only honoured but refreshed. Hygiene wasn't an isolated act. It was social. It carried meaning beyond the body, reaching into the realm of hospitality and community care. Cleanliness, both personal and environmental, was a language of generosity. It said, "You're important. You're worthy of my effort. You're safe here." When a guest entered a dwelling, whether it was a birch-bark wigwam, an earth lodge, a Navajo hogan, or a coastal plank house, they weren't simply handed a bowl of stew. They were often offered water to wash with, sometimes a bundle of herbs to smell or rub on the hands. If the guest had travelled far, a host might guide them to a stream for a rinse or provide a bowl of warm water and a cloth. In colder seasons, warmed stones were wrapped in cloth and used to clean hands or feet, offering both sanitation and comfort. Among the Anishinaabe, offering cedar tea wasn't just about hydration, it was purification. The first cup, steeped with care, could help clear the body and the spirit. To drink it was to cleanse from the inside, a subtle preparation for meaningful conversation. The home itself was prepared with equal care. Among the Haudenosaunee, visitors might be greeted with sweet-smelling smoke drifting through the longhouse. Before a guest arrived, women would sweep the floor with cedar branches, clear the air with smudge smoke, and often scatter crushed herbs or flowers near the doorway. The air itself said, "Welcome. You're entering a clean, peaceful space." Scent played a powerful role in this ritual. Sweetgrass, cedar, and sage weren't just cleansing tools, they were aromatic invitations. In the Pacific Northwest, households burned strips of spruce bark or dried berries to scent the home. In the Southwest, families rubbed adobe walls with mud infused with herbs, creating a subtle, lingering fragrance that warmed as the day wore on. Guests often brought scents of their own, too. A travelling elder might carry a pouch of crushed lavender or mountain mint, dabbing a bit on their pulse points before entering a new community. A young man might offer a sachet of sweet-smelling herbs as a token of respect when courting or visiting a potential bride's family. This was more than fragrance, it was etiquette. And yes, hygiene extended to communal gatherings. Ceremonial lodges, feast halls, and council spaces were cleaned with extra care before large events. Floors were swept. Smoke was used to fumigate the air. Water was set aside specifically for washing hands before meals or rituals. Some tribes placed fragrant twigs at entry points, both to cleanse and symbolically purify those entering sacred space. Among the Lakota, guests were expected to be offered water and a place to sit upon arrival, preferably near the fire. Before eating, it was common for everyone to wash their hands using a shared bowl, with the water discarded afterward in a respectful location. This wasn't about germs in the modern sense. It was about balance, ritual, and showing that your hands were clean, your intentions pure. And the guest, in turn, might cleanse themselves before visiting. It was not uncommon for someone to stop at a stream on the way to a feast or council meeting, washing their face and hands as a sign of respect. This mirrored a spiritual principle found across tribes. You don't bring your dirt into another person's space, physically or spiritually. Children were taught this from a young age. Before entering another home, they learned to brush off dust, smooth their hair, and sometimes pass through a light smudge of smoke. Clean feet, clean faces, tidy clothing. These weren't aesthetic preferences. They were social tools. They communicated mindfulness, discipline, and readiness. Food sharing brought its own cleanliness customs. Eating bowls and utensils, when used, were rinsed in clean water, sometimes with ashes or herbal teas, then dried with cloths made of tanned hide or plant fibre. Communal bowls were approached with clean hands, and dipping was done with care. Among the Pueblo people, families might assign a young person to ensure everyone had washed before eating. A gentle enforcer of etiquette. Some groups took hospitality even further. Among the Tlingit, visiting dignitaries were offered steam baths upon arrival. Heated stones were placed in wooden tubs, water poured over them, and the guest invited to sweat and relax before any formal greeting. It wasn't luxury, it was respect. The logic was simple: cleanse the body, calm the mind, open the heart. Colonial settlers sometimes wrote of these customs with bewilderment. One English trader complained that he was forced to bathe before entering the tribal hall, though I had no mind for it, and the stream was icy. What he missed was the honour, being treated not as a burden, but as someone worth preparing for. To be cleaned for is to be cherished. There were even rituals for welcoming returning family. A hunter coming home from a long journey might be greeted not just with food, but with a rinsing bowl and fresh clothes. His weapons were wiped clean, his moccasins aired out, his hair gently brushed by a sibling or spouse. Cleanliness marked reunion. It said, "You've returned. Let's begin again." In the desert, where water was scarce, hospitality took on an inventive flair. The Pima and Papago peoples sometimes offered guests a handful of powdered herbs to rub on their hands and faces, a fragrant blend of mesquite ash and desert mint. This dry wash freshened the skin and signalled welcome in the absence of water. Among the Inuit, heated stones were wrapped in cloth and placed under a guest's feet while they drank tea. This subtle act, warming and drying the feet, was both hygienic and nurturing. The body was respected, no detail ignored. Historians often overlook these customs, focusing instead on grand rituals or political councils. But to understand a culture's heart, watch how it welcomes. Hygiene wasn't only a private concern, it was social, symbolic, and central to trust. A clean space said, "You can rest here." A sweet scent said, "You're not just a traveller, you're a friend." Today, echoes of these traditions still thrive. Many native homes begin gatherings with smudging, not just for prayer, but to clear energy. Cedar is still burned in kitchens, water bowls sit near doorways, and the instinct to clean before a guest arrives? Alive and well. So the next time someone stops by your home and you rush to tidy up, light a candle, or offer them something fresh, know that you are honouring an ancient lineage, one where welcome means warmth, clean hands, clean hearts, and maybe a hint of sweetgrass in the air. Because true hospitality doesn't start with the meal, it begins with the body, with the breath, with the simple, sacred act of making someone feel not just seen but refreshed. The woman kneels in the shallow stream, her eyes closed, the current tugging softly at her skirt. Around her waist, a sash of red cloth flutters slightly in the water. In one hand she holds a bundle of herbs, tied carefully with twine, soaked in cedar and mint. She dips the bundle into the stream, raises it to her skin, and begins to wash. Slow, steady, reverent. She's not ill. She's not dirty. She's simply menstruating. And in her culture, this is a time for reflection, care, and extraordinary cleanliness. If there's a taboo topic in the hygiene history of Native America, it's menstruation. Misunderstood, often erased, and rarely discussed outside academic circles, the management of monthly cycles among Indigenous women was as practical as it was spiritual. Not shameful, but sacred. Not hidden, but respectfully acknowledged. And most importantly, it was clean, effective, and community supported. Let's begin with materials. Without modern pads or tampons, how did native women manage their periods? The answer, unsurprisingly, is ingenious simplicity. Many tribes use soft, absorbent materials layered into washable or disposable cloths. Sphagnum moss, yes, the same used for infants, was a favourite. It's naturally absorbent, antiseptic, and could be collected in quantity. When dried and packed into a deerskin or bark fibre wrap, it formed a comfortable, effective pad. Other regions used alternatives suited to their ecosystems. In the southwest, women of the Hopi and Zuni gathered fluffy cotton fibres, sometimes combined with yucca leaves or cattail down. Along the coast, some women used sea sponge or seaweed layers dried and softened. In forested regions, shredded cedar bark or fine grasses were dried, bundled and sewn into soft cloth pads, secured by belts, sashes, or simply tucked into the folds of their clothing. These pads were changed regularly, washed in streams, and sun-dried or smoked for sterilisation. In colder months, cloths might be boiled in herbal water, then dried near the fire. Reuse was common, but so was replacement. Nothing was held on to once it risked irritation or infection. And no, there were no scented wipes or blue liquid commercials, just generations of women who knew their bodies intimately and managed them with grace, herbs, and time. But menstrual hygiene was never just about materials. It was about space. Across many Indigenous nations, menstruation was seen as a powerful liminal time, a threshold between physical and spiritual energy. Women were not considered unclean in the colonial sense. Instead, they were in ceremony. Their bodies were moving through a sacred cycle, and that required rest, reflection, and often separation, not as exclusion, but protection. Among the Diné, Navajo, the Kinalda ceremony celebrated a girl's first menstruation with 4 days of ritual, reflection, and beauty. She was bathed, her hair washed and braided, her skin smeared with cornmeal and herbs. A menstrual hut or designated area might be set aside where she could rest and be cared for by elder women. During this time, she learned about her responsibilities, her lineage, and her role in the world. In the Pacific Northwest, menstrual huts were common. These were not punishment chambers, they were peaceful retreats. Women gathered together during their cycles, cared for one another, shared stories, and performed light cleansing tasks. They brought their own bedding, herbs, and food. The space was quiet, warm, and smoke-scented. The separation wasn't about shame, it was about energy. Some tribes believed that menstrual blood carried immense spiritual force, so powerful it could disrupt ceremonial balance if not honoured properly. Thus, menstruating women refrained from certain rituals, not because they were impure, but because they were already operating on a higher inward plane. Daily hygiene within these spaces was meticulous. Women washed themselves morning and evening using herbal rinses, sage, yarrow, cedar, or even pine. In desert regions, sand or clay was rubbed gently on the thighs and rinsed off to cool and cleanse the skin. In colder climates, warm cloths infused with smoke or herbal oils were used in place of water. Steam baths were common, particularly on the final day of the cycle, as a way to close the ceremony and return to daily life. Menstrual cloths were stored with care. Some women kept a dedicated pouch or basket for their materials, often lined with soft fur or cedar chips to keep moisture and insects away. These items weren't hidden in shame. They were treated like tools, maintained, respected, essential, and the community supported it. Men did not mock or fear menstruation. Elders did not scold young girls for staining clothes. Instead, families adjusted around the cycle. Meals might be brought to the menstrual lodge. Children knew not to interrupt. The idea of PMS as a cultural punchline, entirely foreign. Interestingly, there were even scent rituals specific to this time. Some women rubbed their skin with sweet-smelling oils, juniper or lavender to soothe cramps or lift mood. Others burned specific herbs within the lodge, creating a comforting aroma believed to ease tension. This blend of physical relief and emotional support was light years ahead of anything offered in colonial towns. And those colonists, they were baffled. Early missionaries in particular struggled to understand native menstruation customs. They labelled menstrual lodges as superstitious exile huts and attempted to forbid their use in Christianized communities. One missionary wrote in horror about young girls isolated and left to whisper strange prayers in blood-stained tents. What he didn't see was the sisterhood, the quiet strength, the warm bowl of cedar tea passed hand to hand. There were, of course, variations across geography. In nomadic tribes where temporary camps were the norm, menstruation was often managed without separate structures. Women used soft moss pads, washed in nearby streams, and simply modified their activity levels as needed. Among the Inuit, blood-soaked moss was frozen and discarded far from the settlement, where predators couldn't scent it. Clean snow was used for both washing and soothing. No shame, just adaptation. Among the Iroquois, menstrual blood was thought to carry creation energy. Some oral traditions describe it as life turned inward. Women during their cycle were encouraged to rest from heavy labour, avoid spiritual rituals, and instead focus on storytelling, prayer or crafting. They weren't excluded, they were redirected, inward and upward. Today, in many native communities, these traditions are returning. Young women are reclaiming red sashes, sewing their own moss pads, holding moontime circles where girls can talk, learn, and celebrate their bodies. Herbalists revive recipes for cramp relief teas and bath soaks. Elders teach smudging ceremonies for the start and end of each cycle. There are challenges, of course. Modern schedules don't always allow for menstrual rest. Boarding schools and cultural erasure severed many generational lines. But the knowledge persists, in whispers, journals, bundles, and the quiet resilience of women who refuse to forget. So the next time someone sneers at primitive hygiene, or wonders aloud how Indigenous women managed, remember the steam baths, the herbal pads, the painted red belts tied with pride. Remember the girl, freshly bled, standing before her grandmother, learning not how to hide her cycle, but how to honour it. Menstruation wasn't hidden. It was held, carefully, cleanly, culturally. And perhaps that's the most profound truth of all. In a world that still struggles to talk about periods without discomfort or condescension, the women of the past already had it figured out. They cleaned themselves not because they were ashamed, but because they respected themselves, deeply, daily, without apology. The man walks to the edge of the clearing, pine needles crunching beneath his moccasins. He carries a small bundle, a flat stone, a wooden stick, and a pouch of dry ash. With practiced calm, he kneels at a respectful distance from camp, choosing a spot where the soil is soft and the air flows free. This is not a random ritual, it's sanitation, and it's been thought through. Tonight we're headed to the outhouse, or rather its ancient natural equivalent. Because one question, however delicately phrased, always seems to hover like an uncomfortable ghost when people consider life before plumbing. Where did they go to the bathroom? And more importantly, how did they keep things clean? It turns out Indigenous people had detailed, sophisticated methods for managing waste, solid and otherwise. Methods that balance practicality, environmental care, and in many cases a degree of social etiquette that would put most frontier settlements to shame. Let's start with the basics, the open-air bathroom. In nomadic or semi-nomadic tribes, people practiced what we might now call cathol etiquette. When nature called, individuals or groups travelled a short distance from the main living area, typically downwind and away from water sources. There they would dig a shallow hole using a stick, antler tine, or even a shaped stone tool. After relieving themselves, the waste was covered with earth, snow, or sometimes dry leaves and ash. This simple process, dig, do, cover, minimised odour, prevented contamination, and kept insects at bay. Some groups marked preferred spots with small branch structures or stones, indicating that a site had been used and should be avoided for a few days. Among the plains tribes there were even designated latrine circles at the perimeter of larger encampments. These areas were rotated frequently. Waste was never dumped near water sources, and the entire community understood the logic behind spacing, wind direction, and cleanliness. In forested regions like those inhabited by the Iroquois or Algonquin, latrines were often dug near trees whose bark could be peeled in strips for wiping. Birch bark, in particular, was favoured for its softness and absorbency. In colder seasons, people might use clean snow or even handfuls of moss, each material chosen for its availability and comfort. And then there was the ash, nature's little miracle powder. Fine ash from cooking fires was often sprinkled over fresh waste to neutralise odour and discourage flies. This also aided decomposition and made the site easier to manage if revisited. Among the Choctaw, small bowls of ash were sometimes carried by travellers for this exact purpose, allowing them to create impromptu sanitary stations along trails. But what about more permanent settlements? In village-based tribes like the Hopi, Zuni, or Mississippian cultures of the southeast, waste management took on a more structured form. Some pueblos had designated dumping areas far from water cisterns or communal paths. These were regularly burned, covered with ash, or excavated when full. In some desert communities, chamber pots made of clay were used overnight, especially during cold months, and then emptied and washed in designated areas the following morning. Among the ancestral Puebloans, archaeologists have found evidence of latrine-like rooms in cliff dwellings, enclosed spaces with drainage grooves or waste pits, often located downhill from living quarters. These areas were carefully cleaned, with ash and sand layered to absorb moisture. Even the Inuit living on frozen tundra developed methods for waste control. In the deep cold of winter, human waste would freeze instantly and be carried away from the igloo or sod house, often deposited in snow pits well downwind. In warmer months, moss-lined latrines were used and then burned or buried. The theme here is clear. Waste was dealt with, not ignored. There was no concept of simply leaving it lying about or dumping it near food. While European cities of the same era often tossed chamber pots out of windows onto streets, no, seriously, native communities showed a far greater awareness of sanitation and public health, even if they never used those terms. And what about wiping? Let's talk tools. Depending on the environment, people used a variety of natural materials to clean themselves after defecation. Moss, bark, smooth stones, snow, dry leaves, or even tufts of animal fur were used, and often disposed of in the same pit or fire. Certain tribes even carried personal wiping bundles. Among the Ojibwe, small cloths made of softened hide or tightly woven plant fibres were folded and kept in waste pouches, particularly for long travel. These were rinsed and dried after use, then reused as needed. Some southeastern tribes preferred a water wash. After relieving themselves, they would rinse with water from a small gourd bowl or stream. using their hand in a method not unlike traditional Indian, South Asian hygiene practices. This was followed by drying with a cloth or simply air. Children were taught early to respect the rules. Don't go near the water. Cover your hole. Never wipe with poison ivy. These were as ingrained as don't touch the fire or stay close to the lodge. Cleanliness wasn't a lecture, it was a rhythm. Menstruation waste was also handled with care. Used pads or moss were burned, buried, or carried away from communal areas. Some tribes had specific rituals or locations for disposing of menstrual materials, understanding both the practical need and the symbolic power of blood, and urination equally mindful. In forested areas, people often stepped behind a tree or large bush, relieving themselves in designated spots. In the desert, sandy hollows were used. Where water was precious, people made sure to urinate downhill and far from any spring, stream or catchment basin. Some larger settlements even created pea trenches, lined with absorbent materials like sand, ash or cedar boughs. These were changed regularly, often with the same frequency as cooking ash was replenished. Cultural etiquette surrounded it all. In many tribes, it was considered rude to relieve yourself too close to camp, especially during ceremony or communal gathering. Certain areas, like hunting grounds, sacred groves, or fields used for food, were strictly off-limits. And before leaving for long journeys, some people performed cleansing rituals to ensure that they did not bring waste where it was not welcomed. There were even stories told to reinforce good habits. In one Lakota tale, a careless man who urinated too close to a sacred site lost his hunting luck until he made amends. Children grew up hearing such cautionary tales, not as scary bedtime stories, but as reminders that the land remembers. European colonists, once again, were bewildered. One fur trapper remarked that his Cree hosts disappeared like ghosts each morning with their bundles, returning clean-faced and calm, while I still wiped my eyes with a greasy handkerchief. Another wrote in confusion that they seem not to build privies, yet none among them stink. That's because the land was their privy, used with care, reverence and rules. Today, as modern sanitation systems creak under urban pressure and eco-toilets gain traction, some of these ancient practices are coming back into vogue. Composting toilets. Native people have been composting human waste with ash and soil for centuries. Leave no trace? Already standard practice in most indigenous communities. Wiping with smooth stones. Not a TikTok trend, just good sense when moss is frozen. What's perhaps most astonishing is how little waste native societies left behind, physically and ecologically. There are entire settlement sites with no foul odours, no festering piles, no human contamination near water sources. Compare that to 17th century London, where the Thames doubled as both water source and sewer. So the next time you flush, spare a moment for the man with the flat stone and ash pouch, for the woman who teaches her daughter to step carefully, dig respectfully, and leave the earth better than she found it. Cleanliness, you see, was never just about the body. It was about harmony, with the land, with each other, with the cycles of life that never pause, not even for a bathroom break. The obsidian edge gleams in the morning light, cool and curved with the precision of ancient hands. With one swift movement it slides across the forearm, lifting a patch of fine hair. The man exhales slowly, wiping the blade clean on a strip of deerskin. Around him, others sit in similar focus, shaving, scraping, tending to their faces and bodies with calm ritual. This isn't a moment of vanity, it's grooming. And for Native American tribes, it was both deeply personal and surprisingly advanced. Let's pull back the curtain on another under-discussed but utterly essential part of pre-contact hygiene: hair removal. From facial grooming to full-body maintenance, Indigenous communities had their own detailed practices, using sharpened shells, stone blades, and even singeing techniques to keep skin smooth and well kept. Not because of imposed standards, but because of cultural values that made grooming an expression of discipline, readiness, and sometimes beauty. Start with the face. In many tribes, particularly among the plains and eastern woodlands, men removed their facial hair regularly. Beards and moustaches were generally not common, and when they did grow, they were often plucked or shaved. Among the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, it was customary for warriors and leaders to present a clean-shaven face, considered a sign of sharpness and control. Without metal razors, this meant improvisation. Stone tools, specifically small, finely chipped flakes of obsidian or chert, were used as razors. Their edges, although fragile, were extremely sharp. When dragged carefully across the skin, they could slice through hair without much discomfort. Users would heat the stones slightly or dampen the skin first to reduce irritation. Afterward, the skin was often soothed with a salve of bear grease or herb-infused oil. Others used tweezers, yes, actual tweezers, crafted from bone, wood, or 2 pieces of shell bound together. These were ideal for plucking facial hairs or grooming eyebrows. Among the Navajo, men sometimes plucked their facial hair strand by strand using small bone pincers, often during conversations or while resting, as casually as someone might whittle a stick. And this wasn't limited to the face. Body hair removal was also practiced in various forms. Some warriors shaved their entire heads, save for a top knot or central strip of hair, what Europeans would later call a mohawk. This wasn't random fashion, it was battle prep. Removing the hair reduced the risk of being grabbed in combat and showed readiness. It also made paint application easier, as many warriors painted their scalps before battle or ceremony. Among the Mississippian cultures, archaeological evidence from grooming tools and figurines suggests that elite members may have engaged in regular body hair removal, particularly before public events. In ceremonial contexts, being clean-shaven and smooth-skinned reflected not only personal hygiene but spiritual clarity. Hair removal among women varied widely. Some tribes valued smooth skin on the arms and legs, while others placed less emphasis on it. But in regions where insect exposure was high, such as marshy environments, removing body hair was a matter of comfort. In these cases, women used the same tools: sharp stones, clam shells, or even heated sticks to singe hair away gently. Singeing was especially common in coastal tribes. A thin stick, charred at one end, could be passed quickly over the skin to burn away fine hair. The process was fast, mildly scented, thanks to burnt hair, and followed by rubbing with ash or astringent herbs to close the pores. Think of it as ancient laser hair removal, minus the laser, and plus a lot more nerve. But it wasn't just about hair. Skin itself received daily attention. After shaving or plucking, people often applied mixtures made from clay, crushed herbs, and animal fats to soothe and smooth. Among the Cherokee, a paste of cornmeal and crushed dogwood leaves was applied to exfoliate and cool the skin after grooming. In the southwest, aloe-like plants were used to prevent razor burn before such a concept even had a name, and then came the scent. After grooming, both men and women might anoint themselves with lightly scented oils, bear fat infused with cedar, pressed sunflower oil mixed with sage, or even pine resin diluted with water. These weren't overpowering colognes, but soft, lingering hints of forest, river, and fire. Children, too, were taught these habits early. Young boys learned to shave or pluck their facial hair under the guidance of older men, often during their adolescent rites of passage. A father might show his son how to hold a stone blade, where to begin, and how to avoid cuts. In some stories, it's described almost like a whispered lesson: don't rush. The hair grows faster if you do. Young girls, likewise, were taught to keep their skin soft and clean. If body hair was removed, it was done gently, with guidance and appropriate materials, and even if not removed, it was groomed, washed, scented, respected. Some scholars debate how widespread body hair removal really was. Archaeological evidence, stone razors, bone tweezers, singeing tools is abundant. But because hair doesn't preserve in the archaeological record, exact grooming patterns are hard to trace. Still, oral histories and early colonial journals give strong clues. One Jesuit missionary wrote in astonishment that his Huron hosts lacked the beards of civilized men, which he attributed to poor genetics, not realizing they actively plucked their facial hair. Another explorer among the Wichita noted that the men shaved themselves smooth as a mirror and painted their skin like fresh clay. These weren't wild guesses, they were descriptions of deliberate grooming practices, and cleanliness tied it all together. Whether removing lice, as discussed earlier, shaping the hairline, or prepping for war paint, grooming was about readiness, for social interaction, ceremony, or survival. A clean-shaved body reflected discipline. It said, "I am present. I am prepared." Interestingly, this extended into spiritual practices. Among some tribes, shaving one's head marked a new life chapter. After a death in the family, some men shaved their heads in mourning. After a vision quest, a young man might remove all hair to symbolically begin again. It wasn't about looks, it was about marking transition. Hair had power, but so did its absence. Today, many Indigenous people continue these traditions, albeit adapted to modern tools. Plucking with bone has given way to tweezers, and obsidian razors now sit in museums rather than morning routines. But the values remain: grooming as respect, grooming as ritual, grooming not as forced beauty standard but as a personal expression of identity. Some native-owned wellness brands have even revived traditional grooming products: cedar oil, beard balms, sage-infused shave creams, exfoliating clay scrubs made from ancestral recipes. It's not just nostalgia, it's reclamation. So next time you run a razor along your skin or examine your brows in the mirror, remember the obsidian edge, the bone pincer, the gentle hand of an elder showing how to clean not just for others, but for yourself. Because to be well groomed in Indigenous cultures wasn't about looking good for someone else. It was about feeling right with the earth, the spirits, and the face you carried into the firelight. The morning sun filters through the smoke hole of the longhouse, catching tiny particles suspended in air. Dust, maybe, or something more sacred. A woman rises with a bundle of dried cedar tucked beneath one arm and a broom made from bundled reeds in the other. Her movements are deliberate, rhythmic. She begins sweeping from the far end, moving dust and spirits alike toward the door. The space isn't just being cleaned, it's being honoured. In Indigenous North America, a clean home was a harmonious home. Not sanitised in the industrial bleach-scented sense, but in the balanced, spiritually attuned way that kept both people and energy moving smoothly. Whether living in a dome-shaped wigwam, an adobe pueblo, a log-and-earth pit house, or a sprawling coastal longhouse, native communities approached domestic hygiene with a wisdom that blended cleanliness, comfort, and connection. Let's start with the physical side. Floors were swept daily, often multiple times per day. Depending on the region, sweeping tools varied: bundles of stiff grass, thin willow branches tied together, or even woven brooms made from fibrous plant stalks like corn husks. Among the Iroquois, broom making was a seasonal craft. Families gathered specific reeds, dried and tied them, then hung the brooms near the hearth. Every child knew how to sweep. It wasn't a chore, it was a shared responsibility. Sweeping wasn't just about removing debris, it was symbolic. You always swept toward the door, never into corners or back onto the fire. This was about inviting in clarity, pushing out negativity. In Pueblo homes, this act was often accompanied by humming or quiet prayers. It was said that a well-swept home kept the family's thoughts clean too. Beyond sweeping, surfaces were wiped with damp cloths, strips of deerskin, softened bark or woven cotton, depending on the region. These were rinsed daily in streams or small basins. Among coastal tribes, seawater was sometimes used for wiping tables and floors, the salt acting as a natural disinfectant. Dusting, you bet. Many tribes used small fans made of feathers or fur to gently dust ceremonial items, shelves, and even elders' resting spots. In some homes, children were assigned to this task, carefully brushing smoke-stained beams and storage baskets while elders told stories nearby. Then there was fumigation, smoke used to purify the home and its air. Smudging wasn't limited to prayer. It was also a practical act of domestic care. Burning cedar, sweetgrass or sage not only cleared spiritual clutter, but also killed bacteria and discouraged pests. The smoke flowed through sleeping areas, kitchen corners, and gathering spots, cleansing as it curled. The scent lingered long after the fire died down, comforting and earthy. Homes were designed with airflow in mind. Teepees had adjustable flaps. Longhouses had smoke holes. Hogans had intentional ventilation. Air didn't stagnate. It moved. And with it, odours, insects, and excess moisture. Among the Navajo, cleanliness extended to the Hogan's organization. Everything had its place: baskets, tools, firewood, water vessels. Clutter was considered not only impractical but also spiritually disruptive. A clean space made for a clear mind. Bedrolls and blankets were aired daily. At sunrise, many families would lift bedding from the floor and drape it over poles or branches outside, allowing the sun and wind to refresh them. Among the Inuit, caribou skins used as bedding were beaten lightly with bone paddles to remove hair and dust, then placed near the hearth to dry and smoke. This discouraged mites and mildew, keeping the sleeping area clean despite frigid conditions. In desert communities, floors were sometimes coated with a thin layer of clay or crushed sandstone mixed with water and ash. This hardened surface could be swept clean, and maintained easily. In some pueblos, women would reapply the floor coating weekly, mixing in plant pigments for colour and decoration. Cleanliness met artistry. Water was sacred and never wasted. Washing dishes or wiping surfaces required careful planning. Grey water, used from washing hands, faces or cookware, was often poured into specific areas outside the home, away from paths and food prep zones. Some homes had dug-out pits filled with sand and charcoal that filtered wastewater naturally. Children learned to help from the moment they could walk. They swept, fetched water, cleaned bowls. But it wasn't drudgery, it was contribution. A child might take pride in having the tidiest sleeping spot or the best polished bowl. Cleanliness was linked to respect, not just for others, but for the spirits believed to dwell within and around the home. Even seasonal cleaning existed. At the end of winter, homes were refreshed, bedding changed, floors relayered, walls wiped down. Spring brought not just planting but purification. Among the Yurok and Carrick of California, ceremonial houses were cleaned with intense detail before festivals. Smoke, water, cedar boughs and chants all combined in a full-space cleanse. In many tribes, homes were rebuilt or moved seasonally. The act of packing, disassembling and relocating naturally involved cleaning. Materials were dusted, tools wiped, and items reorganised. It wasn't just about moving, it was about resetting the rhythm of the family, and yes, there was a humorous side to it all. Oral traditions include stories of spirits annoyed by clutter, of children punished with dusty blankets, or tricksters hiding in messy corners. These tales weren't just entertainment, they were hygiene lessons in disguise. Keep your lodge swept or you'll invite mischief, went one saying. Another warned, a dirty hearth brings burnt bread. Colonial visitors often misunderstood these domestic rituals. One Englishman wrote in disbelief that his Shawnee hosts swept their tent thrice in a day and perfumed their bedding with pine, assuming it was some sort of mystical excess. He didn't realise he was witnessing one of the most hygienic homes on the continent. Others found themselves marvelling at the neatness of meals. Eating mats were wiped, bones disposed of cleanly, fingers rinsed with herbal water. Among the Chinook, guests were given dampened cloths to clean their hands before eating fish. In Haudenosaunee longhouses, communal bowls were wiped with cornhusk cloths and set on clean leaves or mats. It was all intentional. Today, echoes of these practices persist. Many native families continue to smudge their homes regularly, not just for spiritual reasons, but because it feels cleaner. Handmade brooms are still used in some communities. Children still learn to sweep, wipe and air out bedding with the same quiet diligence their ancestors practiced. And Indigenous eco-builders and architects are returning to ancient principles, airflow, smoke channels, multi-use spaces, to create modern homes that breathe, cleanse and harmonise. Because the wisdom hasn't gone anywhere, it's just evolving. So next time you mop your floor, open your windows or light a candle to freshen the air, remember the woman with the cedar bundle and reed broom, the child dusting shelves with a feather fan, the elder reapplying clay to the floor in time with a song. Clean homes, clean spirits. That's the truth that carried across centuries, built not from bricks and pipes, but from care, smoke, and sweeping songs at sunrise. The clink of pewter cutlery echoes faintly off timber walls as a colonial housewife pours water from a basin into a pitcher. The water is cloudy. It smells vaguely of fish. She grimaces but washes her hands anyway. Outside, the streets of Boston or Philadelphia run with the slop of chamber pots, tossed out windows with cries of "Gardy-loo!" It's 1700, and European settlers are still grappling with the very idea of sanitation. Meanwhile, not far away, a young Algonquin girl scrubs her hands with cedar-scented water by the riverside. Her fingers red from the chill but clean, her skin fragrant and supple. The irony? Her way of life will soon be labelled uncivilized by the very people who stink of sweat, rot, and old wigs. Tonight, we arrive at the cultural collision point, the great hygiene face-off between early Native Americans and colonial settlers. And spoiler, the so-called primitive folk were often the cleaner party. Let's start with first impressions. When European explorers, traders and missionaries first encountered indigenous communities in North America, their accounts brimmed with judgment. They called native homes smoky, crude and earthy. They wrote of skin smeared with paint and hair worn long and wild. But many also recorded with surprise that native people bathed regularly, that they smelled of herbs, not rot, that their homes were neat, their tools orderly, and their food preparation strangely sterile for people who supposedly lived like beasts. And yet these same observers often downplayed or dismissed what they saw. Why? Because hygiene, in European tradition, was tangled in class, modesty, and religious dogma. By the 1600s, large parts of Europe had come to distrust bathing. Many believed that hot water opened the pores and let in miasmas, unseen evil vapours that caused illness. Public bathhouses, once popular, had fallen out of favour after being associated with disease and immorality. Instead, people wore linen undergarments to draw out impurities, and changed their clothes more often than they washed their bodies. Even aristocrats might bathe only a few times a year. King Louis XIV of France reportedly took just 2 or 3 full baths in his lifetime, preferring to wipe himself with cloth soaked in rosewater. Queen Elizabeth I used a scented cloth on her face and hands and believed soap would ruin her complexion. Colonial settlers brought these attitudes with them. Bathing in rivers was seen as uncouth or dangerous. Open nudity, even in private, was frowned upon. And medical texts of the day warned that frequent washing could weaken the body's defences. By contrast, many Native American tribes bathed daily, sometimes multiple times a day. Cold water plunges, steam lodges, smoke baths, and herbal rinses were all part of a cultural logic that tied physical cleanliness to health, honour, and spirituality. So when colonists described native people as dirty, what they often meant was, they don't dress like us, pray like us, or cover their bodies in the same way. It was less about actual dirt and more about difference, yet contradictions abound. Take, for example, a 17th century Jesuit priest in the Great Lakes region who scolded a group of Ojibwe women for bathing topless in the river, but then admitted they did so with great modesty and purpose and not for idle pleasure. Or the explorer who remarked that the Wendats smell not of grease nor filth, but of herbs and wood smoke, and their garments are free of vermin. And let's not forget lice. While European settlers routinely shared hats, wigs and beds, often resulting in infestations, many native communities had active lice prevention practices, nitpicking, herbal washes, smoke cleansing, and daily grooming. Early colonial towns lacking sewage systems often reeked. Human waste was dumped into the streets or nearby rivers, outhouses were rarely cleaned. Drinking water was drawn from the same sources used for dumping refuse. The result? Outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and typhus were common. Native communities, while not immune to disease, especially those brought by Europeans, tended to suffer less from internal outbreaks tied to sanitation. Their waste disposal methods, as we've seen, were cleaner, more conscious, and often tied to seasonal or spiritual cycles. Even food preparation reveals a stark contrast. Colonial kitchens, particularly in frontier settlements, were frequently unclean. Food sat out, rats scurried freely. Preserved meats were often salted to the point of toxicity just to prevent rot. Bread was sometimes baked with dead insects in the dough, considered an acceptable protein boost. Native cooking areas, by contrast, were outdoors, or in well-ventilated hearth spaces. Meat was dried, smoked, or roasted fresh. Storage was handled with baskets, pottery and root cellars, many lined with herbs to deter pests. Women cleaned tools after use, washed their hands, and kept cooking areas free of debris. The result? Fewer foodborne illnesses and fewer stomach woes. And what about dental hygiene? As we've already covered, native people used chewing sticks, herbal rinses, and ash scrubs to clean their teeth. They rarely consumed refined sugar and ate diets high in fibrous vegetables and lean proteins. Their teeth, as a result, were often strong, white, and straight. European settlers, with their sugar-rich diets and fear of toothbrushes, frequently lost their teeth by middle age. In fact, some missionaries commented with envy on native smiles, noting the lack of rot and the freshness of breath. Still, the myth of the filthy savage persisted. Why? Because it served a purpose. Labelling indigenous people as dirty or uncivilized helped justify conquest, land seizure, and forced conversion. It framed colonists as bringers of not only faith but soap. Never mind that the soap was rarely used. It turned cultural difference into moral deficiency. And once the myth took hold, it spread faster than any fire in a dry forest. Boarding schools, designed to civilize native children, reinforced this lie. Students were scrubbed with lye soap, forbidden from bathing in rivers, stripped of herbal traditions. Cleanliness was weaponized. It became a tool for erasure. And yet the truth lingered. In bones, journals, and oral stories, archaeologists studying pre-contact settlements consistently find evidence of cleanliness: swept floors, orderly trash pits, separate cooking and latrine areas. Some sites show decades of occupation without signs of pestilence or contamination. Compare that to London or Paris, where plagues routinely swept through due to sewage in the streets and corpses in the wells. Even today, the myth endures. Schoolbooks still refer to native homes as simple or unsanitary. Western wellness trends rediscover new ideas, like cold plunges, herbal rinses, clay scrubs, without acknowledging that Indigenous cultures practiced them for millennia. But times are shifting. Indigenous scholars, healers, and historians are reclaiming the narrative. They're publishing books, running clinics, hosting workshops on traditional wellness. They're teaching youth not just the what of hygiene, but the why. The stories behind the practices, the songs sung while sweeping, the meaning behind the cedar smoke bath. There's pride, not just in being clean, but in being clean the old way. So next time someone makes a joke about how native people must have been dirty, invite them to picture a colonial street ankle-deep in sewage, a chamber pot being dumped onto cobblestone, a nobleman powdering his lice-ridden wig. Then picture a woman washing her hands in a mountain stream, her skin fragrant with yarrow and pine, or a child sweeping the longhouse floor with a broom made of cedar twigs, or a man entering a sweat lodge to cleanse not only his body but his spirit. Because cleanliness, like culture, isn't measured by soap bubbles, it's measured by care, consistency, and connection. And by that measure, the record is clear. Native people weren't behind. They were ahead. A soft breeze stirs the sagebrush outside a small earthen lodge. Inside, the air is thick with sweetgrass and cedar smoke. A young woman lays out bundles of dried herbs on a woven mat. Mint, juniper, lavender. Each one has a scent, a story, a memory. Her grandmother taught her which to use for fevers, which to wash with after hard days, and which to burn when the house feels heavy. As she dusts the shelves and opens the door to the morning sun, she's not just cleaning. She's continuing a legacy. We've travelled far through the intimate rituals and practical brilliance of Native American hygiene. From cedar smoke to moss diapers, obsidian razors to communal grooming circles. What unfolds is not a portrait of neglect or primitiveness, but a tapestry of thoughtful, sustainable and sophisticated care. In this final stretch, we bring it full circle by looking at how Indigenous hygiene practices have not only endured but evolved, influencing modern sustainability and wellness movements in ways the world is just beginning to acknowledge. Let's start with the land. From the beginning, native hygiene was symbiotic with the natural world. It didn't rely on imported oils or plastic packaging. Everything, from birch bark toothpaste to clay body scrubs, came directly from the environment and returned to it harmlessly. There were no clogged sewers, no chemical runoff, no overflowing landfills of disposable pads or synthetic wipes. This relationship wasn't born of scarcity. It was born of respect. Take, use, give back. If moss was gathered, another patch was left to grow. If water was used for bathing, it was done downstream from drinking sites and never with harsh soaps. Waste wasn't flushed away in ignorance. It was buried, composted, returned to the cycle. And now, slowly but surely, the wider world is circling back to these principles. The modern zero waste movement, those glass jars of bulk goods, shampoo bars, composting toilets, is, whether knowingly or not, echoing practices native people have used for thousands of years. Natural deodorants, try crushed sage and bare fat, used by Indigenous folks long before aluminum-free formulas filled Whole Foods shelves. Herbal tooth powders, birch bark, sage ash and mint-infused sticks got there first. Cold plunges, sweat lodges, ice baths and stream dips were routine, not Instagram challenges. And let's not forget the minimalist approach to personal products. While modern households often overflow with lotions, scrubs, wipes, toners and essences, traditional native hygiene relied on multi-purpose staples. One oil for skin, hair and joints. One herb bundle for steam, scent and smudging. There was no excess because every item had to be gathered, prepared and respected. This same ethic is now being rediscovered in the language of sustainability. Buy less, use longer. Know what's in your products. Support local and natural. All of it sounds familiar to anyone who's ever watched an elder render bare grease by hand or braid sweetgrass for washing. Even modern native-owned businesses are bridging past and present. Across Turtle Island, entrepreneurs are reviving ancestral recipes for soap, shampoo and skincare. They use ingredients like yucca root, cedar oil, wild tallow and cornmeal scrubs. Packaged minimally, often in recyclable or biodegradable containers, and always with cultural integrity at the core. In Montana, a small company offers salves based on Lakota healing traditions, blends once rubbed on tired feet after long days walking the plains. In Arizona, dinner makers produce blue corn exfoliating bars that double as ceremony offerings. These aren't niche curiosities, they're the future, rooted deeply in the past. And while the products may evolve, the mindset stays the same. Cleanliness is not about status or control, it's about readiness, about balance, about showing respect to oneself, to others, to the spirit of the place you inhabit. This ethos carries into environmental activism as well. Native communities have long led efforts to protect clean water, defend sacred springs, and promote eco-friendly housing. Why? Because their hygiene practices have always depended on living systems. If the river is poisoned, there is no bath. If the moss is stripped bare, the baby goes without. The logic is direct, immediate, and unshakable. That same directness now informs protests at oil pipelines, campaigns for land back, and pushes for indigenous land management techniques and conservation circles. Is not just about politics, it's about survival and the continuation of a lifestyle that knew how to keep both body and land clean. And what about young people? There's a resurgence underway. In native schools, youth learn to make cedar shampoo and mint tooth powder. They participate in wellness days that include steam lodges, hair-brushing ceremonies, and lessons on water gratitude. These are not reenactments, they are continuations. One teenager might grow herbs behind her home and infuse her own lotion. Another might ask his grandmother to teach him how to clean a sweat lodge, learning to sweep it not just for dust, but for spiritual clarity. Across reservations and urban communities alike, native youth are claiming hygiene not as a colonial standard, but as cultural strength. And the world is starting to listen. University researchers now study Indigenous cleaning methods for insights into low-impact sanitation. Designers consult native architects on airflow and smoke management in eco-homes. Museums dedicate exhibits not just to war clubs and feathered regalia, but to grooming combs, cradleboard padding, and herbal wash bowls. Historians are rewriting textbooks to acknowledge that the people who were once called dirty savages likely bathed more, groomed better, and lived cleaner, physically and spiritually, than many of the Europeans who came to judge them. Of course, challenges remain. Many native communities still face issues of access, clean water, quality housing and healthcare. Centuries of displacement, forced assimilation and poverty have strained the very systems that once kept hygiene so embedded in daily life. But the knowledge hasn't died. It waits in seed banks, story circles and cedar smoke prayers. It stirs in the bundles passed from elder to grandchild, in the sweet grass hung above a doorway, in the quiet dignity of a home that is clean not just from bleach, but from balance. So let's return to the lodge, where the young woman finishes arranging her herbs. She lights a smudge bundle and lets the smoke curl up toward the beams. The space smells like safety, like continuity, like the opposite of forgetting. She doesn't know it, but she's not just tidying, she's resisting and renewing and reminding the world that hygiene isn't a European invention. It's not a luxury. It's not about perfection. It's about stewardship, of body, of home, of earth. And no one knew that better than the people who bathed in streams before the arrival of soap, who cleaned with sage before Lysol was bottled, and who believed, quietly, profoundly, that the way you treat your space is the way you treat your soul. So now, with the last of our cedar smoke drifting into the night and the embers low in the hearth, let's ease back. The lodges are swept. The water bowls are still. The air carries the scent of sweetgrass and quiet history. You've journeyed across time, through the intimate rhythms of daily life that so many historians skim past. You've seen how care took shape in river baths and steam lodges, in smooth pebbles and moss diapers, in the deliberate, unspoken language of clean hands and quiet spaces. Not for show, not for status, but because it felt right, because it kept things balanced. Take a long, slow breath. Imagine the hush of a snow-dusted village, the faint splash of a stream where someone is still washing their hands, gently, with intention. Maybe a child giggles in the background. Maybe a broom swishes in a heartbeat rhythm across a packed earth floor. Everything soft, everything simple. In this world, hygiene is not a checklist. It's a way of honouring life. Each wash, each sweep, a small act of love. For the self, for the family, for the land that sustains it all, and now you carry that story with you. The next time you light a candle to clear a space or rinse your hands after a long day, you might remember the elders who taught us how it's done. Slowly, respectfully, with laughter when needed, and always with a deep grounded peace. So rest now, clean and calm. The past is not behind you, it's wrapped around you like a soft, fragrant blanket.